When I reached C Company lines, which were at the top of the hill, I paused and looked back at the camp, just coming into full view below me through the grey mist of early morning. We were leaving that day. When we marched in 3 months before, the place was under snow. Now the first leaves of spring were unfolding. I had reflected then that whatever scenes of desolation lay ahead of us, I never feared one more brutal than this, and I reflected now that it had no single happy memory for me. Here love had died between me and the army. Here the tram lines ended, so that men returning fuddled from Glasgow could doze in their seats until roused by their journey's end. Over the way, the subject of much ironical comment, half hidden even in winter by its embosoming trees, lay the municipal lunatic asylum, whose cast-iron railings and noble gates put our rough wire to shame. As we marched past, the men used to shout greetings to them through the railings. "Keep a bed warm for me, chum, I shan't be long." But Hooper, my newest joined platoon commander, grudged them their life of privilege. "Hitler would put them in a gas chamber," he said. "I reckon we can learn a thing or two from him." Here, at the age of 39, I began to be old. I felt stiff and weary in the evenings, and reluctant to go out of camp. I developed proprietary claims to certain chairs and newspapers. I regularly drank 3 glasses of gin before dinner, never more or less, and went to bed immediately after the 9 o'clock news. I was always awake and fretful an hour before Reveille. Here my last love died. So, on this morning of our move, I was entirely indifferent as to our destination. I would go on with my job, but I could bring to it nothing more than acquiescence. Hooper appeared. He was a sallow youth, with hair combed back without parting from his forehead, and a flat Midland accent. He had been in the company 2 months. In the weeks that we were together, Hooper became a symbol to me of young England, so that whenever I read some public utterance proclaiming what youth demanded in the future, and what the world owed to youth, I would test these general statements by substituting Hooper, and seeing if they still seemed as plausible. Thus, in the dark hour before Reveille, I sometimes pondered Hooper rallies, Hooper hostels, international Hooper cooperation, and the religion of Hooper. He was the acid test of all these alloys. As we marched past the madhouse, 2 or 3 elderly inmates gibbered and mouthed politely behind the railings. "Cheero, chum, we'll be seeing you. We shan't be long now. Keep smiling till we meet again," the men called to them. I was marching with Hooper at the head of the leading platoon. "I say, any idea where we're off to?" "None." "Do you think it's the real thing?" "No." "Just a flap?" "Yes," I said. In half an hour we were ready to start, and in an hour we started. My 3 platoon commanders and myself had a carriage to ourselves. They ate sandwiches and chocolate, smoked and slept. None of them had a book. At last, very late, we came to our siding. Soon Hooper's platoon had marched off into the darkness. The company second in command came down with the first returning truck. "It's not a bad camp," he reported. "Big private house with 2 or 3 lakes. Looks as if we might get some duck if we're lucky. Village with 1 pub and a post office. No town within miles." I asked the second in command, "What's this place called?" He told me. And on the instant, it was as though someone had switched off the wireless, and a voice that had been bawling in my ears incessantly, fatuously, for days beyond number, had been suddenly cut short. For he had spoken a name that was so familiar to me, a conjurer's name of such ancient power, that at its mere sound the phantoms of those haunted late years began to take flight. It was a sequestered place, enclosed and embraced in a single winding valley. Our camp lay along one gentle slope. Opposite us, the ground led, still unravished, to the neighbourly horizon, and between us flowed a stream. It was named the Bride, and rose not 2 miles away at a farm called Bride Springs, where we used sometimes to walk to tea. It became a considerable river lower down, before it joined the Avon, which had been dammed here to form 3 lakes, one no more than a wet slate among the reeds, but the others more spacious, reflecting the clouds and the mighty beeches at their margin. The woods were all of oak and beech, the oak grey and bare, the beech faintly dusted with green by the breaking buds. They made a simple, carefully designed pattern with the green glades and the wide green spaces. Did the fallow deer graze here still? And lest the eye wander aimlessly, a Doric temple stood by the water's edge, and an ivy-grown arch spanned the lowest of the connecting weirs. All this had been planned and planted a century and a half ago, so that at about this date it might be seen in its maturity. From where I stood, the house was hidden by a green spur, but I knew well how and where it lay, couched among the lime trees like a hind in the bracken. Hooper came sidling up and greeted me with his much imitated but inimitable salute. "The house is up there round the corner. Brigade headquarters are coming there next week. Great barrack of a place. I've just had a snoop round. Very ornate, I'd call it. And a queer thing, there's a sort of R.C. church attached. I looked in, and there was a kind of service going on, just a padre and one old man. I felt very awkward, more in your line than mine." Perhaps I seemed not to hear. In a final effort to excite my interest, he said, "There's a frightful great fountain, too, in front of the steps, all rocks and sort of carved animals. You never saw such a thing." "Yes, Hooper, I did. I've been here before." The words seemed to ring back to me enriched from the vaults of my dungeon. "Oh, well, you know all about it. I'll go and get cleaned up." I had been there before. I knew all about it. "I have been here before," I said. I had been there before. First with Sebastian, more than 20 years ago, on a cloudless day in June, when the ditches were creamy with meadowsweet and the air heavy with all the scents of summer. It was a day of peculiar splendor, and though I had been there so often, in so many moods, it was to that first visit that my heart returned on this, my latest. That day, too, I had come not knowing my destination. It was Eights Week. Oxford, submerged now and obliterated, irrecoverable as Lyonnesse, so quickly have the waters come flooding in. Oxford, in those days, was still a city of aquatint. In her spacious and quiet streets, men walked and spoke as they had done in Newman's day. Her autumnal mists, her grey springtime, and the rare glory of her summer days, such as that day, when the chestnut was in flower and the bells rang out high and clear over her gables and cupolas, exhaled the soft airs of centuries of youth. It was this cloistral hush which gave our laughter its resonance and carried it still joyously over the intervening clamour. Here, discordantly, in Eights Week, came a rabble of womankind, some hundreds strong, twittering and fluttering over the cobbles and up the steps, sightseeing and pleasure-seeking, drinking claret cup, eating cucumber sandwiches, pushed in punts about the river, herded in droves to the college barges. Echoes of the intruders penetrated every corner, and in my own college was no echo, but an original fount of the grossest disturbance. We were giving a ball. No one felt more strongly about it than my scout. What do they want with dancing? I don't see the reason in it. And never was dancing before in Eights Week. Commend now is another matter, being in the vacation, but not in Eights Week, as if teas in the river wasn't enough. If you ask me, sir, it's all on account of the war. It couldn't have happened but for that. For this was 1923, and for Lunt, as for thousands of others, things could never be the same as they had been in 1914. "Now, wine in the evening," he continued, as was his habit, half in and half out of the door, "or one or two gentlemen to luncheon, there's reason in, but not dancing. Well, here's Lord Sebastian. I mustn't stand here talking when there's pincushions to get." Sebastian entered. Dove-grey flannel, white crepe de chine, a Charvet tie, my tie as it happened, a pattern of postage stamps. "Charles, what in the world's happening at your college? Is there a circus? I've seen everything except elephants. I must say the whole of Oxford's become most peculiar suddenly. Last night it was pullulating with women. You're to come away at once out of danger. I've got a motor car and a basket of strawberries and a bottle of Chateau Perrier, which isn't a wine you ever tasted, so don't pretend. It's heaven with strawberries. Beyond the gate, beyond the winter garden, that was once the lodge, stood an open two-seater Morris Cowley. Sebastian's teddy bear sat at the wheel. We put him between us. "Take care he's not sick," and drove off. On a sheep-cropped knoll under a clump of elms, we ate the strawberries and drank the wine, as Sebastian promised they were delicious together, and we lit fat Turkish cigarettes, and lay on our backs, Sebastian's eyes on the leaves above him, mine on his profile, while the blue-grey smoke rose untroubled by any wind to the blue-green shadows of foliage, and the sweet scent of the tobacco, merged with the sweet summer scents around us and the fumes of the sweet golden wine, seemed to lift us a finger's breadth above the turf and hold us suspended. "Just the place to bury a crock of gold," said Sebastian. "I should like to bury something precious in every place where I've been happy, and then when I was old and ugly and miserable, I could come back and dig it up and remember." This was my third term since matriculation, but I date my Oxford life from my first meeting with Sebastian, which had happened by chance in the middle of the term before. We were in different colleges and came from different schools. I might well have spent my 3 or 4 years in the university and never have met him, but for the chance of his getting drunk one evening in my college and of my having ground-floor rooms in the front quadrangle. I had been warned against the danger of these rooms by my cousin Jasper, who alone, when I first came up, thought me a suitable subject for detailed guidance. My father offered me none. Then, as always, he eschewed serious conversation with me. I knew Sebastian by sight long before I met him. That was unavoidable, for from his first week he was the most conspicuous man of his year, by reason of his beauty, which was arresting, and his eccentricities of behaviour, which seemed to know no bounds. My first sight of him was in the door of Germer's, and on that occasion I was struck less by his looks than by the fact that he was carrying a large teddy bear. "That," said the barber as I took his chair, "was Lord Sebastian Flight, a most amusing young gentleman." "Apparently," I said coldly. "The Marquis of Marchmain's second boy. His brother, the Earl of Brideshead, went down last term. Now he was very different, a very quiet gentleman, quite like an old man." "What do you suppose Lord Sebastian wanted?" "A hairbrush for his teddy bear. It had to have very stiff bristles. Not Lord Sebastian said to brush him with, but to threaten him with a spanking when he was sulky. He bought a very nice one with an ivory back, and he's having Aloysius engraved on it. That's the bear's name." When at last we met, the circumstances were not propitious. It was shortly before midnight in early March. I had been entertaining, and from the quad outside came the not uncommon sounds of bibulous laughter and unsteady steps. Then there appeared at my window the face I knew to be Sebastian's, but not as I had formerly seen it, alive and alight with gaiety. He looked at me for a moment with unfocused eyes, and then, leaning forward well into the room, he was sick. The next morning a note was left for me. "I am very contrite. Aloysius won't speak to me until he sees I am forgiven, so please come to luncheon today. Sebastian Flight." It was typical of him, I reflected, to assume I knew where he lived, but then I did know. Sebastian lived at Christchurch, high in meadow buildings. He was alone when I came, peeling a plover's egg taken from the large nest of moss in the centre of his table. Mummy sends them from Brideshead. They always lay early for her. When the eggs were gone and we were eating the lobster Newburg, the last guest arrived. "My dear," he said, "I couldn't get away before. I was lunching with my preposterous tutor. He thought it very odd my leaving when I did. I told him I had to change for footer." He was tall, slim, rather swarthy, with large, saucy eyes. The rest of us wore rough tweeds and brogues. He had on a smooth chocolate-brown suit with loud white stripes, suede shoes, a large bow tie, and he drew off yellow wash-leather gloves as he came into the room. Part Gallic, part Yankee, part perhaps Jew. Wholly exotic. This, I did not need telling, was Anthony Blanche, the aesthete par excellence, a byword of iniquity from Charvel Edge to Somerville. He'd been pointed out to me often in the streets as he pranced along with his high peacock tread, I had heard his voice in the George challenging the conventions, and now, meeting him under the spell of Sebastian, I found myself enjoying him voraciously. It was 4 o'clock before we broke up. Anthony Blanche was the first to go. The others left soon after him. I rose to go with them, but Sebastian said, "Have some more Cointreau." So I stayed, and later he said, "I must go to the Botanical Gardens." "Why?" "To see the ivy." It seemed a good enough reason, and I went with him. He took my arm as we walked under the walls of Merton. "I've never been to the Botanical Gardens," I said. "Oh, Charles, what a lot you have to learn. There's a beautiful arch there, and more different kinds of ivy than I knew existed. I don't know where I should be without the Botanical Gardens." That day was the beginning of my friendship with Sebastian, and thus it came about that morning in June that I was lying beside him in the shade of the high elms, watching the smoke from his lips drift up into the branches. We drove on, and in the early afternoon came to our destination. Wrought-iron gates and twin classical lodges on a village green, an avenue, more gates, open parkland, a turn in the drive, and suddenly a new and secret landscape opened before us. We were at the head of a valley, and below us, half a mile distant, grey and gold amid a screen of boscage, shone the dome and columns of an old house. "Well," said Sebastian, stopping the car. Beyond the dome lay receding steps of water, and round it, guarding and hiding it, stood the soft hills. "Well?" "What a place to live in," I said. "You must see the garden front and the fountain." He leaned forward and put the car into gear. "It's where my family live." And even then, wrapped in the vision, I felt momentarily an ominous chill at the words he used, not "that is my house," but "it's where my family live." "Don't worry," he continued, "they're all away. You won't have to meet them." "But I should like to." "Well, you can't. They're in London. I want you to meet Nanny Hawkins. That's what we've come for." Sebastian's Nanny was seated at the open window. The fountain lay before her, the lakes, the temple, and far away on the last spur a glittering obelisk. Her hands lay open in her lap, and loosely between them a rosary. Sebastian kissed her. "Who's this?" she said, looking at me. "I don't think I know him." Sebastian introduced us. "You've come just the right time. Julia's here for the day. Such a time they're all having. Did you see this piece about Julia in the paper? She brought it down for me. Not that it's nearly good enough of her, but what it says is very nice. The lovely daughter whom Lady Marchmain is bringing out this season, witty as well as ornamental, the most popular debutante." Sebastian said we had to go. "All right," I said, "I'm perfectly content. But am I not going to be allowed to see any more of the house?" "It's all shut up. We came to see Nanny. On Queen Alexandra's Day it's all open for $1. Well, come and look if you want to." His mood had changed since we had drunk our wine under the elm trees, since we had turned the corner of the drive and he had said, "Well?" "You see, there's nothing to see. A few pretty things I'd like to show you one day, not now. But there's the chapel. You must see that. It's a monument of Art Nouveau." The last architect to work at Brideshead had added a colonnade and flanking pavilions. One of these was the chapel. We entered it by the public porch. Another door led direct to the house. Sebastian dipped his fingers in the water stoop, crossed himself, and genuflected. I copied him. "Why do you do that?" he asked crossly. "Just good manners." "Well, you needn't on my account. You wanted to do sightseeing. How about this?" The whole interior had been gutted, elaborately refurnished, and redecorated in the arts and crafts style of the last decade of the 19th century. "Golly," I said. "It was Papa's wedding present to Mamma. Now, if you've seen enough, we'll go." On the drive, we passed a closed Rolls-Royce driven by a chauffeur. In the back was a vague, girlish figure who looked round at us through the window. "Julia," said Sebastian. "We only just got away in time." The further we drove from Brideshead, the more he seemed to cast off his uneasiness, the almost furtive restlessness and irritability that had possessed him. The sun was behind us as we drove, so that we seemed to be in pursuit of our own shadows. That is the full account of my first brief visit to Brideshead. Could I have known then that it would one day be remembered with tears by a middle-aged captain of infantry? Towards the end of that summer term, I received the last visit and grand remonstrance of my cousin Jasper. This was to be no cosy chat. He stood with his back to the fireplace, and in his own phrase talked to me like an uncle. I expected you to make mistakes your first year, but you, my dear Charles, whether you realize it or not, have gone straight, hook, line, and sinker into the very worst set in the university. There's that chap Sebastian Flight you seem inseparable from. He may be all right, I don't know. His brother Brideshead was a very sound fellow, but this friend of yours looks odd to me, and he gets himself talked about. Of course, they're an odd family. The Marchmains have lived apart since the war, you know. An extraordinary thing. Everyone thought they were a devoted couple. Then he went off to France with his yeomanry and just never came back. It was as if he'd been killed. She's a Roman Catholic, so she can't get a divorce. Or won't, I expect. Flight may be all right, but Anthony Blanche, now there's a man there's absolutely no excuse for. I don't particularly like him myself, I said. And drink. No one minds a man getting tight once or twice a term. In fact, he ought to on certain occasions. But I hear you're constantly seen drunk in the middle of the afternoon. I'm sorry, Jasper, I said. I know it must be embarrassing for you, but I happen to like this bad set. I like getting drunk at luncheon, and though I haven't yet spent quite double my allowance, I undoubtedly shall before the end of term. I usually have a glass of champagne about this time. Will you join me? On the day after Jasper's grand remonstrance, I received another, in different terms and from an unexpected source. All the term I had been seeing rather more of Anthony Blanche than my liking for him warranted. I lived now among his friends, but our frequent meetings were more of his choosing than mine, for I held him in considerable awe. At the age of 15, for a wager, he was disguised as a girl and taken to play at the big table in the Jockey Club at Buenos Aires. He dined with Proust and Gide, and was on closer terms with Cocteau and Diaghilev. Furbank sent him his novels with fervent inscriptions. He'd aroused 3 irreconcilable feuds in Capri. By his own account, he had practiced black art in Cefalù, and had been cured of drug-taking in California and of an Oedipus complex in Vienna. He asked me to dinner, and I was a little disconcerted to find that we were to dine alone. Sebastian has charm. He held up his glass of hock to the candlelight and repeated, such charm. I can see he's completely captivated you, my dear Charles. Well, I'm not surprised. Of course, you haven't known him as long as I have. I was at school with him. He and I were both Catholics, so we used to go to Mass together. He used to spend such a time in the confessional. I used to wonder what he had to say, because he never did anything wrong. Never quite. At least he never got punished. Perhaps he was just being charming through the grill. I forget if you know his family. I don't suppose he'll ever let you meet them. He's far too clever. They're quite gruesome. Do you ever feel there's something a teeny bit gruesome about Sebastian? No? Perhaps I imagine it. It's simply that he looks so like the rest of them sometimes. There's Brideshead, who's something archaic out of a cave that's been sealed for centuries. He has the face as though an Aztec sculptor had attempted a portrait of Sebastian. He's a learned bigot, a ceremonious barbarian, a snow-bound llama. Well, anything you like. And Julia, you know what she looks like. Who could help it? Her photographs appear as regularly in the illustrated papers as the advertisements for Beecham's pills. A face of flawless, Florentine, Quattrocento beauty. There's another sister, too, I believe, in the schoolroom. Nothing is known of her yet, except that our governess went mad and drowned herself not long ago. I'm sure she's abominable. So, you see, there was really very little left for poor Sebastian to do, except be sweet and charming. It's when one gets to the parents that a bottomless pit opens. My dear, such a pair! How does Lady Marchmain manage it? It's one of the questions of the age. You've seen her. Very, very beautiful. No artifice. Her hair just turning grey, in elegant silvery streaks, no rouge, very pale, huge-eyed. It's extraordinary how large those eyes look, and how the lids are vein blue, when anyone else would have touched them with a fingertip of paint. Pearls, and a few great star-like jewels, heirlooms. in ancient settings, a voice as quiet as a prayer and as powerful. And Lord Marchmain, well, a little fleshy perhaps, but very handsome. Magnifico, voluptuary, Byronic, bored, infectiously slothful, not at all the sort of man you'd expect to see easily put down. How does Lady Marchmain do it? She has convinced the world that Lord Marchmain is a monster. And what is the truth? They were married for 15 years or so, and then Lord Marchmain went to the war. He never came back, but formed a connection with a highly talented dancer. There are 1,000 such cases. She refuses to divorce him because she's so pious. Well, there have been cases of that before. Usually it arouses sympathy for the adulterer, not for Lord Marchmain, though. You would think that the old reprobate had tortured her, stolen her patrimony, flung her out of doors, roasted, stuffed, and eaten his children, and gone frolicking about wreaths in all the flowers of Sodom and Gomorrah. Instead of what? Begetting 4 splendid children by her, handing over to her Brideshead and Marchmain House in St. James's, and all the money she can possibly want to spend, while he sits with a snowy shirt-front at La Rue's with a personable, middle-aged lady of the theatre in most conventional Edwardian style. And she, meanwhile, keeps a small gang of enslaved and emaciated prisoners for her exclusive enjoyment. She sucks their blood. They never escape once she's had her teeth into them. It's witchcraft. There's no other explanation. I returned home for the long vacation without plans and without money. My father, I knew, was in the house, but his library was inviolable, and it was not until just before dinner that he appeared to greet me. He was then in his late 50s, but it was his idiosyncrasy to seem much older than his years. To see him, one might have put him at 70, to hear him speak at nearly 80. He came to me now with a shuffling Mandarin tread which he affected, and a shy smile of welcome. "It's a very long vacation," he said wistfully. "In my day we used to go on what were called reading parties, always in mountainous areas." Why, he repeated petulantly, should alpine scenery be thought conducive to study? "One of the problems of the vacation is money, Father." "Oh, I shouldn't worry about a thing like that at your age. You see, I've run rather short." "Yes," said my father, without any sign of interest. "In fact, I don't quite know how I'm going to get through the next 2 months." "Well, I'm the worst person to come to for advice. I've never been short, as you so painfully call it. And yet what else could you say? Hard up, penurious, distressed, embarrassed, stony broke, snuffle, on the rocks, in Queer Street. Let's say you're in Queer Street and leave it at that." During the sultry week that followed, my relations with my father deteriorated sharply. The dinner table was our battlefield. On the second evening I took my book with me to the dining-room. His mild and wandering eye fastened on it with sudden attention, and as we passed through the hall, he surreptitiously left his own on a side table. When we sat down, he said plaintively, "I do think, Charles, you might talk to me. I've had a very exhausting day. I was looking forward to a little conversation." Dinner that evening consisted of a white, tasteless soup, over-fried fillets of sole with a pink sauce, lamb cutlets propped against a cone of mashed potato, stewed pears in jelly standing on a kind of sponge cake. It is purely out of respect for your Aunt Philippa that I dine at this length. She laid it down that a 3-course dinner was middle class. It is odd to think that she and I once dined together nightly, just as you and I do, my boy. Now she made unremitting efforts to take me out of myself. She thought I should get into funny ways if I was left on my own. Perhaps I have got into funny ways. Have I? But it didn't do. I got her out in the end. There was an unmistakable note of menace in his voice as he said this. "I got her out in the end," he said, with derision and triumph of that kindly lady, and he knew that I heard in the words a challenge to myself. Next day, by chance, a weapon came to hand. I met an old acquaintance of school days, a contemporary of mine named Jorkins. I never had much liking for Jorkins. Once in my Aunt Philippa's day he'd come to tea, and she had condemned him as being probably charming at heart, but unattractive at first sight. Now I greeted him with enthusiasm and asked him to dinner. He came and showed little alteration. My father must have been warned by Hayter that there was a guest, for instead of his velvet suit, he wore a tailcoat. This, with a black waistcoat, very high collar, and very narrow white tie, was his evening dress. He wore it with an air of melancholy, as though it were court mourning which he had assumed in early youth, and finding the style sympathetic, had retained. He never possessed a dinner jacket. Good evening, so nice of you to come all this way. Oh, it wasn't far, said Gielgud, who lived in Sussex Square. Science annihilates distance, said my father disconcertingly. You are over here on business? Well, I'm in business, if that's what you mean. I had a cousin who was in business. You wouldn't know him. It was before your time. I was telling Charles about him only the other night. He's been much in my mind. He came, my father paused to give full weight to the bizarre word, a cropper. Gielgud giggled nervously. My father fixed him with a look of reproach. You find his misfortune the subject of mirth? Or perhaps the word I used was unfamiliar. You no doubt would say that he folded up. My father was master of the situation. He had made a little fantasy for himself that Gielgud should be an American, and throughout the evening he played a delicate one-sided parlour game with him, explaining any peculiarly English terms that occurred in the conversation, translating pounds into dollars, and courteously deferring to him with such phrases as, of course, by your standards, all this must seem very parochial to Mr. Gielgud, in the vast spaces to which you were accustomed, so that my guest was left with a vague sense that there was a misconception somewhere as to his identity, which he never got the chance of explaining. Again and again during dinner he sought my father's eye, thinking to read there the simple statement that this form of address was an elaborate joke, but met instead a look of such mild benignity that he was left baffled. Once I thought my father had gone too far, when he said, I am afraid that living in London you must sadly miss your national game. My national game? Asked Gielgud, slow in the uptake, but scenting that here at last was the opportunity for clearing the matter up. My father glanced from him to me, and his expression changed from kindness to malice, then back to kindness again as he turned once more to Gielgud. It was the look of a gambler who lays down fours against a full house. Your national game, he said gently. Cricket. And he snuffled uncontrollably, shaking all over and wiping his eyes with his napkin. Surely, working in the city, you find your time on the cricket field greatly curtailed. At the door of the dining-room he left us. Good night, Mr. Gielgud, he said. I hope you will pay us another visit when you next cross the herring pond. I say, what did your governor mean by that? He seemed almost to think I was American. He's rather odd at times. I mean all that about advising me to visit Westminster Abbey. It seemed rum. Yes, I can't quite explain. I almost thought he was pulling my leg, said Gielgud in puzzled tones. One Sunday afternoon a telegram came from Sebastian. My father was out, and returned to find me in a condition of feverish anxiety. I showed him the telegram, which read simply, Gravely injured, come at once, Sebastian. Well, said my father, I'm sorry you're upset. Reading this message, I should not say that the accident was as serious as you seem to think. Otherwise it would hardly be signed by the victim himself. Still, of course, he may well be fully conscious, but blind, or paralyzed, with a broken back. Why exactly is your presence so necessary? You have no medical knowledge, you are not in holy orders. Do you hope for a legacy? I told you he's a great friend. Well, Orme Herrick is a great friend of mine, but I should not go tearing off to his deathbed on a warm Sunday afternoon. I should doubt whether Lady Orme Herrick would welcome me. However, I see you have no such doubts. I shall miss you, my dear boy, but do not hurry back on my account. Paddington Station on that August Sunday evening, with the sun streaming through the obscure panes of its roof, the bookstall shut, and the few passengers strolling unhurried beside their porters, would have soothed a mind less agitated than mine. The train was nearly empty. I dined and changed trains to the local line, and in twilight came to Melstead Carbery, which was my destination. Brideshead, sir? Yes, Lady Julia's in the yard. She was sitting at the wheel of an open car. I recognized her at once. I could not have failed to do so. You're Mr. Ryder. Jump in. Her voice was Sebastian's, and his her way of speaking. How is he? Sebastian, oh, he's fine. Have you had dinner? Well, I expect it was beastly. There's some more at home. Sebastian and I are alone, so we thought we'd wait for you. What's happened to him? Didn't he say? I expect he thought you wouldn't come if you knew. He's cracked a bone in his ankle, so small that it hasn't a name. But they x-rayed it yesterday and told him to keep it up for a month. I must say it's noble of you to come all this way at a moment's notice. But as she said it, I heard, or thought I heard, a tiny note of contempt in her voice that I should be so readily available. How did he do it? Believe it or not, playing croquet, he lost his temper and tripped over a hoop. Not a very honourable scar. She so much resembled Sebastian that, sitting beside her in the gathering dusk, I was confused by the double illusion of familiarity and strangeness. Because her sex was the palpable difference between the familiar and the strange, it seemed to fill the space between us, so that I felt her to be especially female, as I had felt of no woman before. Here we are. She led me up the steps and into the hall, flung her coat on a marble table, and stooped to fondle a dog which came to greet her. I wouldn't put it past Sebastian to have started dinner. At that moment he appeared between the pillars at the further end, propelling himself in a wheeled chair. He was in pyjamas and dressing-gown, with one foot heavily bandaged. "Well, darling, I've collected your chum," she said, again with a barely perceptible note of contempt. "Good night, Mr. Ryder, and good-bye. I don't suppose we'll meet tomorrow. I'm leaving early. I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for relieving me at the sick-bed." "My sister's very pompous tonight," said Sebastian when she'd gone. "I don't think she cares for me," I said. "I don't think she cares for anyone much. I love her. She's so like me." "Do you? Is she?" "In looks, I mean, and the way she talks. I wouldn't love anyone with a character like mine." When we drank our port, I walked beside Sebastian's chair through the pillared hall to the library, where we sat that night and nearly every night of the ensuing month. It lay on the side of the house that overlooked the lakes. The windows were open to the stars and the scented air, to the indigo and silver moonlit landscape of the valley, and the sound of water falling in the fountain. "We'll have a heavenly time alone," said Sebastian. And when, next morning, while I was shaving, I saw from my bathroom window Julia, with luggage at her back, drive from the forecourt and disappear at the hill's crest without a backward glance, I felt a sense of liberation and peace, such as I was to know years later, when, after a night of unrest, the sirens sounded the all clear. The languor of youth, how unique and quintessential it is, how quickly, how irrecoverably lost. The zest, the generous affections, the illusions, the despair, all the traditional attributes of youth, all save this, come and go with us through life. These things are a part of life itself. But languor, the relaxation of yet unwearied sinews, the mind sequestered and self-regarding, that belongs to youth alone and dies with it. Perhaps in the mansions of limbo the heroes enjoy some such compensation for their loss of the beatific vision. Perhaps the beatific vision itself has some remote kinship with this lowly experience. I, at any rate, believed myself very near heaven during those languid days at Brideshead. "If it was mine, I'd never live anywhere else," I said to Sebastian. "But you see, Charles, it isn't mine. Just at the moment it is, but usually it's full of ravening beasts. If it could only be like this always, always summer, always alone, the fruit always ripe, and Aloysius in a good temper. It's thus I like to remember Sebastian, as he was that summer, when we wandered alone together through that enchanted palace. Part of the terrace was paved, part planted with flower-beds and arabesques of dwarf box. Taller box grew in a dense hedge, making a wide oval, cut into niches and interspersed with statuary, and in the centre, dominating the whole splendid space, rose the fountain. Such a fountain as one might expect to find in a piazza of southern Italy, such a fountain as was indeed found there a century ago by one of Sebastian's ancestors, found, purchased, imported, and re-erected in an alien but welcoming climate. Sebastian set me to draw it. It was an ambitious subject for an amateur, but by some odd chance, for the thing was far beyond me, I brought it off, and by judicious omissions and some stylish tricks produced a very passable echo of Piranesi. We saw a few strangers. There was the agent, a lean and pouchy colonel who crossed our path occasionally and once came to tea. Usually we managed to hide from him. On Sundays a monk was fetched from a neighbouring monastery to say Mass and breakfast with us. He was the first priest I'd ever met. I noticed how unlike he was to a parson, but Brideshead was a place of such enchantment to me that I expected everything and everyone to be unique. Father Phipps was, in fact, a bland, bun-faced man with an interest in county cricket which he obstinately believed us to share. Often, almost daily, since I had known Sebastian, some chance word in his conversation had reminded me that he was a Catholic, but I took it as a foible, like his teddy bear. We never discussed the matter until, on the second Sunday at Brideshead, when Father Phipps had left us and we sat in the colonnade with the papers, he surprised me by saying, "Oh dear, it's very difficult being a Catholic." "Does it make much difference to you?" "Of course, all the time." "Well, I can't say I've noticed it. Are you struggling against temptation? You don't seem much more virtuous than me." "I'm very, very much wickeder," said Sebastian indignantly. "Well, then? Who was it used to pray, 'Oh, God, make me good, but not yet'?" "I don't know. You, I should think." "Why, yes, I do, every day, but it isn't that." He turned back to the pages of the News of the World and said, "Another naughty scoutmaster. I suppose they try and make you believe an awful lot of nonsense." "Is it nonsense?" "I wish it were. It sometimes sounds terribly sensible to me." "But, my dear Sebastian, you can't seriously believe it all." "Can't I? I mean about Christmas and the star and the three kings and the ox and the ass. Oh, yes, I believe that. It's a lovely idea. But you can't believe things just because they're a lovely idea." "But I do. That's how I believe." "And in prayers, do you think you can kneel down in front of a statue and say a few words, not even out loud, just in your mind, and change the weather? Or that some saints are more influential than others, and you must get hold of the right one to help you on the right problem?" "Oh, yes. Don't you remember last term, when I took Aloysius and left him behind, I didn't know where? I prayed like mad to St. Anthony of Padua that morning, and immediately after lunch there was Mr. Nichols at Canterbury Gate, with Aloysius in his arms, saying I'd left him in his cab." "Well," I said, "if you can believe all that, and you don't want to be good, where's the difficulty about your religion?" "If you can't see, you can't." "Well, where?" "Oh, don't be a bore, Charles. I want to read about a woman in Hull who's been using an instrument." "You started the subject. I was just getting interested. I'll never mention it again." 38 other cases were taken into consideration in sentencing her to 6 months. Golly! But he did mention it again some 10 days later, as we were lying on the roof of the house, sunbathing, and watching through a telescope the agricultural show which was in progress in the park below us. Lord Brideshead came down by train in the morning and lunched with Colonel Fender, the agent. I met him for 5 minutes on his arrival. Anthony Blanche's description was peculiarly apt. He had the flight face, carved by an Aztec. We could see him now through the telescope, moving awkwardly among the tenants, stopping to greet the judges in their box, leaning over a pen, gazing seriously at the cattle. "Queer fellow, my brother," said Sebastian. "He looks normal enough." "Oh, but he's not. If you only knew, he's much the craziest of us, only it doesn't come out at all. He's all twisted inside. He wanted to be a priest, you know. I think he still does. He nearly became a Jesuit straight from Stonyhurst. It was awful for Mummy. She couldn't exactly try and stop him, but of course it was the last thing she wanted." "Has your father given up religion?" "Well, he's had to, in a way. He only took to it when he married Mummy. When he went off, he left that behind with the rest of us. You must meet him. He's a very nice man." Sebastian had never spoken seriously of his father before. I said, "It must have upset you all when your father went away." "All but Cordelia. She was too young. It upset me at the time. Mummy tried to explain it to the 3 eldest of us so that we wouldn't hate Papa. I was the only one who didn't. I believe she wishes I did. I was always his favourite. I should be staying with him now if it wasn't for this foot. I'm the only one who goes. Why don't you come too? You'd like him." So you see we're a mixed family religiously. Brideshead and Cordelia are both fervent Catholics. He's miserable, she's bird-happy. Julia and I are half-heathen. I am happy. I rather think Julia isn't. Mummy is popularly believed to be a saint, and Papa is excommunicated, and I wouldn't know which of them was happy. Anyway, however you look at it, happiness doesn't seem to have much to do with it. And that's all I want. I wish I liked Catholics more. We were interrupted in this unusually grave conversation by loud, childish cries from beyond the chimney stacks. "Sebastian! Sebastian!" "Good heavens," said Sebastian, reaching for a blanket. "That sounds like my sister Cordelia. Cover yourself up." "Where are you?" There came into view a robust child of 10 or 11. She had the unmistakable family characteristics, but had them ill-arranged in a frank and chubby plainness. 2 thick, old-fashioned pigtails hung down her back. "Go away, Cordelia, we've got no clothes on." "Why, you're quite decent. Darling Sebastian, I am pleased to see you again. How's your poor foot?" "Say how do you do to Mr. Ryder." Oh, sorry, how do you do?" All the family charm was in her smile. We were a sombre little party that evening. Only Cordelia was perfectly at ease, rejoicing in the food, the lateness of the hour, and her brother's company. Brideshead was 3 years older than Sebastian and I, but he seemed of another generation. He had the physical tricks of his family, and his smile, when it rarely came, was as lovely as theirs. He spoke in their voice with a gravity and restraint which in my cousin Jasper would have sounded pompous and false, but in him was plainly unassumed and unconscious. "I am so sorry to miss so much of your visit," he said to me. "You are being looked after properly. I hope Sebastian is seeing to the wine. Wilcox is apt to be rather grudging when he's on his own." "He's treated us very liberally." "I am delighted to hear it. You are fond of wine?" "Very. I wish I were. It's such a bond with other men. At Magdalen I tried to get drunk more than once, but I did not enjoy it. Beer and whisky I find even less appetizing. Events like this afternoon's are a torment to me in consequence." "I like wine," said Cordelia. My sister Cordelia's last report said that she was not only the worst girl in the school, but the worst there had ever been in the memory of the oldest nun. That's because I refused to be an enfant de Marie. Reverend Mother said that if I didn't keep my room tidier, I couldn't be one, so I said, well, I won't be one, and I don't believe Our Blessed Lady cares 2 hoots whether I put my gym shoes on the left or the right of my dancing shoes. Reverend Mother was livid. Our Lady cares about obedience. "Bridie, you mustn't be pious," said Sebastian. "We've got an atheist with us." "Agnostic," I said. "Really? Is there much of that at your college? There was a certain amount at Magdalen." "I really don't know. I was one long before I went to Oxford." "It's everywhere," said Brideshead. Cordelia said, "Do you know, if you weren't an agnostic, I should ask you for 5 shillings to buy a black goddaughter. It's a new thing a missionary priest started last term. You send 5 bob to some nuns in Africa, and they christen a baby and name her after you. I've got 6 black Cordelias already. Isn't it lovely?" Brideshead and Cordelia went away. The tents were struck on the showground, the flags uprooted. The trampled grass began to regain its colour. The month that had started in leisurely fashion came swiftly to its end. Sebastian walked without a stick now, and had forgotten his injury. "I think you'd better come with me to Venice," he said. "No money." "I thought of that. We live on Papa when we get there. The lawyers pay my fare, first class and sleeper. We can both travel third for that." And so we went. I was full of curiosity to meet Lord Marchmain. When I did so, I was first struck by his normality, which, as I saw more of him, I found to be studied. It was as though he were conscious of a Byronic aura, which he considered to be in bad taste and was at pains to suppress. He was standing on the balcony of the saloon, and as he turned to greet us, his face was in deep shadow. I was aware only of a tall and upright figure. Lord Marchmain's mistress arrived next day. I was 19 years old, and completely ignorant of women. I could not with any certainty recognize a prostitute in the streets. Cara was not a little bit of fluff. She was a middle-aged, well-preserved, well-dressed, well-mannered woman, such as I had seen in countless public places and occasionally met. We became tourists. Cara enlisted as guide a midget Venetian nobleman to whom all doors were open, and with him at her side and a guidebook in her hand, she came with us, flagging sometimes, but never giving up, a neat prosaic figure amid the immense splendours of the place. The fortnight at Venice passed quickly and sweetly, perhaps too sweetly. I was drowning in honey, stingless. I remember most particularly one conversation towards the end of my visit. Sebastian had gone to play tennis with his father, and Clara at last admitted to fatigue. We sat in the late afternoon at the windows overlooking the Grand Canal, she on the sofa with a piece of needlework, I in an armchair idle. It was the first time we'd been alone together. "I think you are very fond of Sebastian," she said. "Why, certainly. I know of these romantic friendships of the English and the Germans. They are not Latin. I think they are very good, if they do not go on too long. Sebastian is in love with his own childhood. That will make him very unhappy. His teddy bear, his nanny, and he is 19 years old." She stirred on her sofa, shifting her weight so that she could look down at the passing boats, and said in fond, mocking tones, "How good it is to sit in the shade and talk of love." And then added with a sudden swoop to earth, "Sebastian drinks too much. I suppose we both do. With you it doesn't matter. I have watched you together. With Sebastian it is different. He will be a drunkard if someone does not come to stop him. I have known so many. Alex was nearly a drunkard when he met me. It is in the blood. I see it in the way Sebastian drinks. It is not your way." Everywhere, on cobble and gravel and lawn, the leaves were falling, and in the college gardens the smoke of the bonfires joined the wet river mist drifting across the grey walls. The flags were oily underfoot, and as one by one the lamps were lit in the windows round the quad, the golden lights were diffuse and remote. New figures in new gowns wandered through the twilight under the arches, and the familiar bells now spoke of a year's memories. "It is typical of Oxford," I said, "to start the new year in autumn." The autumnal mood possessed us both, as though the riotous exuberance of June had died with the gilliflowers, whose scent at my windows now yielded to the damp leaves smouldering in a corner of the quad. It was the first Sunday evening of term. "I feel precisely 100 years old," said Sebastian. There was a change in both of us. We had lost the sense of discovery which had infused the anarchy of our first year. I began to settle down. With Sebastian it was different. His year of anarchy had filled a deep interior need of his, the escape from reality, and as he found himself increasingly hemmed in where he once felt himself free, he became at times listless and morose even with me. It was thus that Lady Marchmain found us, when early in that Michaelmas term she came for a week to Oxford. She found Sebastian subdued, with all his hosts of friends reduced to one, myself. She accepted me as Sebastian's friend, and sought to make me hers also, and in doing so unwittingly struck at the roots of our friendship. That is the single reproach I have to set against her abundant kindness to me. Her business at Oxford was with Mr. Samgrass of All Souls, who now began to play an increasingly large part in our lives. He was a young history don, a short, plump man, dapper in dress, with sparse hair brushed flat over an over-large head, neat hands, small feet, and the general appearance of being too often bathed. His manner was genial, and his speech idiosyncratic. We came to know him well. One Monday morning I was in Sebastian's room, waiting for him to return from a tutorial, when Julia walked in, followed by a large man whom she introduced as Mr. Mottram and addressed as Rex. They were motoring up from a house where they had spent the week-end, they explained. Rex Mottram was warm and confident in a check ulster, Julia cold and rather shy in furs. She made straight for the fire and crouched over it, shivering. Rex Mottram exerted himself to make an impression. He was a handsome fellow, with dark hair growing low on his forehead and heavy black eyebrows. He spoke with an engaging Canadian accent. One quickly learned all that he wished one to know about him, that he was a lucky man with money, a member of Parliament, a gambler, a good fellow, that he played golf regularly with the Prince of Wales and was on easy terms with Max and F.E., and Gertie Lawrence, and Augustus John, and Carpentier, with anyone, it seemed, who happened to be mentioned. Of the university, he said, "No, I was never here. It just means you start life 3 years behind the other fellow." His life, so far as he made it known, began in the war, where he'd got a good MC serving with the Canadians and had ended as ADC to a popular general. He cannot have been more than 30 at the time we met him, but he seemed very old to us in Oxford. Julia treated him as she seemed to treat all the world, with mild disdain, but with an air of possession. It did not surprise me, when I arrived at Brideshead after Christmas, to find Mr. Samgrass, as though in wait for me, sitting alone before the fire in the room they call the Tapestry Hall. Presently Lady Marchmain's party returned, and when, before we went upstairs to dress for dinner, she said, "Who's coming to chapel for the rosary?" and Sebastian and Julia said they must have their baths at once, Mr. Samgrass went with her and the friar. "I wish Mr. Samgrass would go," said Sebastian in his bath. "I'm sick of being grateful to him." Religion predominated in the house, not only in its practices, the daily mass and rosary, morning and evening in the chapel, but in all its intercourse. "We must make a Catholic of Charles," Lady Marchmain said, and we had many little talks together during my visits, when she delicately steered the subject into a holy quarter. After the first of these, Sebastian said, "Has Mummy been having one of her little talks with you? She's always doing it. I wish to hell she wouldn't." Scraps of conversation come back to me with the memory of her room. I remember her saying, "When I was a girl we were comparatively poor, but still much richer than most of the world, and when I married I became very rich. It used to worry me, and I thought it wrong to have so many beautiful things when others had nothing. Now I realize that it is possible for the rich to sin by coveting the privileges of the poor. The poor have always been the favourites of God and his saints, but I believe that it is one of the special achievements of grace to sanctify the whole of life, riches included." But I was untouched by her faith as I was by her charm, or rather I was touched by both alike. I had no mind then for anything except Sebastian, and I saw him already as being threatened, though I did not yet know how black was the threat. His constant despairing prayer was to be let alone. And since Sebastian counted among the intruders his own conscience and all claims of human affection, his days in Arcadia were numbered. For in this, to me, tranquil time, Sebastian took fright. I knew him well in that mood of alertness and suspicion, like a deer suddenly lifting his head at the far notes of the hunt. I had seen him grow wary at the thought of his family or his religion. Now I found I, too, was suspect. He did not fail in love, but he lost his joy of it, for I was no longer part of his solitude. As my intimacy with his family grew, I became part of the world which he sought to escape. I became one of the bonds which held him. That was the part for which his mother, in all our little talks, was seeking to fit me. Everything was left unsaid. It was only dimly and at rare moments that I suspected what was afoot. Outwardly, Mr. Samgrass was the only enemy. After a fortnight, Sebastian said, "I can't stand Mr. Samgrass any more. Let's go to London." So he came to stay with me, and now began to use my home in preference to March's. My father liked him. "I think your friend very amusing," he said. "Ask him often." Then back at Oxford we took up again the life that seemed to be shrinking in the cold air. The sadness that had been strong in Sebastian the term before gave place to a kind of sullenness even towards me. He was sick at heart somewhere, I did not know how, and I grieved for him, unable to help. When he was gay now, it was usually because he was drunk, and when drunk he developed an obsession of mocking Mr. Samgrass. He composed a ditty, of which the refrain was, "Green ass, Samgrass, Samgrass, green ass," sung to the tune of St. Mary's chime, and he would thus serenade him, perhaps once a week, under his windows. Mr. Samgrass was distinguished as being the first Don to have a private telephone installed in his rooms. Sebastian, in his cups, used to ring him up and sing him this simple song. And all this Mr. Samgrass took in good part, as it is called, smiling obsequiously when we met, but with growing confidence, as though each outrage in some way strengthened his hold on Sebastian. It was during this term that I began to realize that Sebastian was a drunkard in quite a different sense to myself. I got drunk often, but through an excess of high spirits, in the love of the moment and the wish to prolong and enhance it. Sebastian drank to escape. As we together grew older and more serious, I drank less, he more. I found that sometimes, after I'd gone back to my college, he sat up late and alone, soaking. A succession of disasters came on him, so swiftly, and with such unexpected violence, that it is hard to say when exactly I recognized that my friend was in deep trouble. I knew it well enough in the Easter vacation. The Easter party at Brideshead was a bitter time, culminating in a small but unforgettably painful incident. Sebastian got very drunk before dinner in his mother's house, and thus marked the beginning of a new epoch in his melancholy record, another stride in the flight from his family, which brought him to ruin. I took him to his room, which was next to mine, and tried to get him to bed, but he sat in front of his dressing table, squinting at himself in the glass, trying to remake his bow tie. On the writing table by the fire was a half-emptied decanter of whisky. I took it up, thinking he would not see, but he spun round from the mirror and said, "You put that down!" "Don't be an ass, Sebastian. You've had enough." "What the devil's it got to do with you? You're only a guest here. My guest. I drink what I want to in my own house." He would have fought me for it at that moment. It was the custom, I learned later, always to ask Lady Marchmain to read aloud on evenings of family tension. She had a beautiful voice and great humour of expression. That night she read part of The Wisdom of Father Brown. Julia sat with a stool covered with manicure things and carefully revarnished her nails. Cordelia nursed Julia's Pekingese. Brideshead played patience. I sat unoccupied, studying the pretty group they made and mourning my friend upstairs. Next day I sought Lady Marchmain. The wind had freshened and we stayed indoors. I sat near her before the fire in her room, while she bent over her needlework and the budding creeper rattled on the window-panes. "I wish I had not seen him," she said. "That was cruel. I do not mind the idea of his being drunk. It's a thing all men do when they're young. I'm used to the idea of it. My brothers were wild at his age. What hurt last night was that there was nothing happy about him." It was impossible for me to explain to her what I only half understood myself. Even then I felt, she will learn it soon enough. Perhaps she knows it now. I did not see Julia that morning, but just as I was leaving, Cordelia ran to the door of the car and said, "Will you be seeing Sebastian? Please give him my special love. Will you remember? My special love." Then I reached Paddington, and returning home, found Sebastian there, and the sense of tragedy vanished, for he was gay and free as when I first met him. "Cordelia sent you her special love. Did you have a little talk with Mummy?" "Yes." "Have you gone over to her side?" The day before I would have said, "There aren't two sides." That day I said, "No, I'm with you. Sebastian contra mundum." And that was all the conversation we had on the subject then or ever. But the shadows were closing round Sebastian. We returned to Oxford, and once again the gilliflowers bloomed under my windows, and the chestnut lit the streets, and the warm stones strewed their flakes upon the cobble. But it was not as it had been. There was midwinter in Sebastian's heart. The weeks went by, and then one night Sebastian had another disaster. He was found by the junior dean at 1 o'clock, wandering round Tom Quad, hopelessly drunk. I had left him morose but completely sober at a few minutes before 12. In the succeeding hour he had drunk half a bottle of whisky alone. He did not remember much about it when he came to tell me next morning. "Have you been doing that a lot?" I asked. "Drinking by yourself after I've gone?" "Oh, about twice, perhaps 4 times. It's only when they start bothering me. I'd be all right if they'd only leave me alone." "They won't now," I said. "I know, there's a plot on. Mummy wants me to go and live with Monsignor Bell." "Why didn't you tell me about it?" "Because I'm not going to live with Monsignor Bell." "Well, what do you propose to do?" "I shan't do anything. They'll do it all." And I let him go without comfort. Then the machinery began to move. Mr. Samgrass and Monsignor Bell saw the Dean of Christ Church. Brideshead came up for a night. The heavy wheels stirred and the small wheels spun. Everyone was exceedingly sorry for Lady Marchmain, whose brother's name stood in letters of gold on the war memorial, whose brother's memory was fresh in many breasts. Sebastian was in my rooms waiting for me. "I'm going to cable to Papa," he said. He won't let them force me into this priest's house." "I told her it wouldn't do," I said. "Shall we get really drunk tonight?" "It's the one time it could do no conceivable harm," I said. "Contra mundum? Contra mundum. Bless you, Charles. There aren't many evenings left to us." And that night, the first time for many weeks, we got deliriously drunk together. I saw him to the gate as all the bells were striking midnight, and reeled back to my rooms under a starry heaven which swam dizzily among the towers, and fell asleep in my clothes as I had not done for a year. Next day Lady Marchmain left Oxford, taking Sebastian with her. Brideshead and I went to his rooms to sort out what he would have sent on and what leave behind. Brideshead was as grave and impersonal as ever. "It's a pity Sebastian doesn't know Monsignor Bell better," he said. "He'd find him a charming man to live with. I was there my last year. My mother believes Sebastian is a confirmed drunkard. Is he?" "He's in danger of becoming one." "I believe God prefers drunkards to a lot of respectable people." "For God's sake," I said, for I was near to tears that morning, "why bring God into everything?" "I'm sorry, I forgot. But you know that's an extremely funny question." "Is it?" "To me, not to you." "No, not to me. It seems to me that without your religion, Sebastian would have the chance to be a happy and healthy man." "It's arguable," said Brideshead. There was only 10 days of term to go. I got through them somehow, and returned to London as I had done in such different circumstances the year before, with no plans made. "That very good-looking friend of yours," asked my father, "is he not with you?" "No. I quite thought he had taken this over as his home. I'm sorry, I liked him." "Father, do you particularly want me to take my degree?" "I want you to? Good gracious, why should I want such a thing? No use to me. Not much use to you either, as far as I've seen." "That's exactly what I've been thinking. I thought perhaps it was rather a waste of time going back to Oxford. I intend to be a painter." But to this my father made no answer at the time. The idea, however, seemed to take root in his mind. By the time we spoke of the matter again, it was firmly established. "When you're a painter," he said at Sunday luncheon, "you'll need a studio." "Yes." "Well, there isn't a studio here. There isn't even a room you could use decently as a studio. I'm not going to have you painting in the gallery." "I don't suppose I should do much painting the first year. Anyway, I should be working at a school." "Abroad?" asked my father hopefully. "There are some excellent schools abroad, I believe." It was all happening rather faster than I intended. "Abroad or here, I should have to look round first." "Look round abroad," he said. "Then you agree to my leaving Oxford?" Agree? My dear boy, you're 22. 20, I said. 21 in October." "Is that all? It seems much longer." A letter from Lady Marchmain completes this episode. "My dear Charles," she wrote, "Sebastian left me this morning to join his father abroad. The college has sent Sebastian down for a term only, and will take him back after Christmas on condition he goes to live with Monsignor Bell. It is for him to decide. Meanwhile, Mr. Samgrass has very kindly consented to take charge of him. As soon as his visit to his father is over, Mr. Samgrass will pick him up, and they will go together to the Levant, where Mr. Samgrass has long been anxious to investigate a number of Orthodox monasteries. He hopes this may be a new interest for Sebastian. Sebastian's stay here has not been happy. When they come home at Christmas, I know Sebastian will want to see you, and so shall we all. I hope your arrangements for next term have not been too much upset, and that everything will go well with you. Yours sincerely, Teresa Marchmain." 3 weeks before Christmas, Lady Marchmain wrote again. "I have just heard from Mr. Samgrass that he and Sebastian will be home for Christmas as we hoped. I had not heard from them for so long that I was afraid they were lost, and did not want to make any arrangements until I knew. Sebastian will be longing to see you. Do come to us for Christmas if you can manage it, or as soon after as you can. Tea had been cleared away and the curtains drawn. It was 2 days after Christmas, the first evening of my visit, the first also of Sebastian's and Mr. Samgrass's. Mr. Samgrass was not at ease. He maintained all the physical habits of self-confidence, but guilt hung about him like stale cigar smoke. He kept up a lively account of his tour during tea, and then Lady Marchmain drew him away with her upstairs for a little talk. It was 7:30. I supposed the others had gone to dress, but as I was going to follow them, I met Brideshead coming down. "Just a moment, Charles, there's something I've got to explain. My mother has given orders that no drinks are to be left in any of the rooms. You will understand why. If you want anything, ring and ask Wilcox, only better wait until you're alone. I'm sorry, but there it is." "Is that necessary?" "I gather very necessary. You may or may not have heard Sebastian had another outbreak as soon as he got back to England. He was lost over Christmas. Mr. Samgrass only found him yesterday evening." "I guess something of the kind had happened. Are you sure this is the best way of dealing with it?" "It's my mother's way." It was an evening of peculiar gloom. We dined in the painted parlour, and that evening we had no inclination to delay. Our glasses were filled with port, and the decanter was at once taken from the room. We drank quickly, and went to the drawing-room, where Brideshead asked his mother to read, and she read the Diary of a Nobody with great spirit until 10 o'clock, when she closed the book and said she was unaccountably tired, so tired that she would not visit the chapel that night. "Who's hunting tomorrow?" she asked. "Cordelia," said Brideshead. "I'm taking that young horse of Julia's just to show him the hounds. I shan't keep him out more than a couple of hours." "Rex is arriving sometime," said Julia. "I'd better stay in to greet him." "Where's the meet?" said Sebastian suddenly. "Just here at Flight St. Mary." "Then I'd like to hunt, please, if there's anything for me." Sebastian got straight to bed. I sat by his fire and smoked a pipe. I said, "I rather wish I was coming out with you tomorrow." "Well," he said, "you wouldn't see much sport. I can tell you exactly what I'm going to do. I shall leave Bridie at the first covert, hack over to the nearest good pub, and spend the entire day quietly soaking in the bar parlour. If they treat me like a dipsomaniac, they can bloody well have a dipsomaniac. I hate hunting anyway." "Well, I can't stop you." "You can, as a matter of fact, by not giving me any money. They stopped my banking account, you know, in the summer. It's been one of my chief difficulties. I pawned my watch and cigarette case to ensure a happy Christmas, so I shall have to come to you for my day's expenses." I gave him £1. "More?" he said. I gave him another. At luncheon, Julia had no thoughts except for her guest who was coming that day. She drove to the station to meet him and brought him home to tea. "Mummy, do look at Rex's Christmas present." It was a small tortoise, with Julia's initials set in diamonds in the living shell. "Dear me," said Lady Marchmain, "I wonder if it eats the same sort of things as an ordinary tortoise." "What will you do when it's dead?" asked Mr. Samgrass. "Can you have another tortoise fitted into the shell?" Rex had been told about the problem of Sebastian. He could scarcely have endured in that atmosphere without, and had a solution pat. He propounded it cheerfully and openly at tea, and after a day of whispering, it was a relief to hear the thing discussed. "Send him to Borathus at Zurich. Borathus is the man. He works miracles every day at that sanatorium of his. He's booked up for months ahead, but I think he'd find room if I asked him. I could telephone him from here tonight." In his kindest moments, Rex displayed a kind of hectoring zeal, as if he were thrusting a vacuum cleaner on an unwilling housewife. "We'll think about it." And we were thinking about it when Cordelia returned from hunting. "Oh, Julia, what's that? How beastly!" "It's Rex's Christmas present." "Oh, sorry, I'm always putting my foot in it, but how cruel! It must have hurt frightfully." "They can't feel." "How do you know? Bet they can." She kissed her mother, whom she had not seen that day, shook hands with Rex, and rang for eggs. When Wilcox came to clear the tea, Lady Marchmain asked, "No sign of Lord Sebastian?" "No, my lady. He must have stopped for tea with someone. How very unlike him." Half an hour later, when Wilcox brought in the cocktail tray, he said, "Lord Sebastian has just rung up to be fetched from South Twining." "South Twining? Who lives there?" "He was speaking from the hotel, my lady." "South Twining," said Cordelia. "Goodness, he did get lost." When he arrived, he was flushed, and his eyes were feverishly bright. I saw that he was 2/3 drunk. "Dear boy," said Lady Marchmain, "how nice to see you looking so well again. Your day in the open has done you good. The drinks are on the table. Do help yourself." There was nothing unusual in her speech, but the fact of her saying it. 6 months ago it would not have been said. "Thanks," said Sebastian, "I will." Next morning I said to Sebastian, "Tell me honestly, do you want me to stay on here?" "No, Charles, I don't believe I do." "I'm no help." "No help." So I went to make my excuses to his mother. "There's something I must ask you, Charles. Did you give Sebastian money yesterday?" "Yes." "Knowing how he was likely to spend it?" "Yes." "I don't understand it," she said. "I simply don't understand how anyone can be so callously wicked." I was unmoved. There was no part of me remotely touched by her distress. It was as I had often imagined being expelled from school. I almost expected to hear her say, "I've already written to inform your unhappy father." But as I drove away and turned back in the car to take what promised to be my last view of the house, I felt that I was leaving part of myself behind, and that wherever I went afterwards I should feel the lack of it and search for it hopelessly, as ghosts are said to do, frequenting the spots where they buried material treasures without which they cannot pay their way to the nether world. "I shall never go back," I said to myself. The door had shut. The low door in the wall I had sought and found in Oxford. Open it now, and I should find no enchanted garden. I had come to the surface, into the light of common day and the fresh sea air, after long captivity in the sunless coral palaces and waving forests of the ocean bed. I had left behind me what? Youth, adolescence, romance, the conjuring stuff of these things, the young magician's compendium, that neat cabinet where the ebony wand had its place beside the delusive billiard balls, the penny that folded double, and the feather flowers that could be drawn into a hollow candle. "I have left behind illusion," I said to myself. "Henceforth I live in a world of 3 dimensions with the aid of my 5 senses." I have since learned that there is no such world, but then, as the car turned out of sight of the house, I thought it took no finding, but lay all about me at the end of the avenue. Thus I returned to Paris, and to the friends I had found there and the habits I had formed. I thought I should hear no more of Brideshead, but life has few separations as sharp as that. It was not 3 weeks before I received a letter in Cordelia's Frenchified convent hand. "Darling Charles," she said, "I was so very miserable when you went. You might have come and said good-bye. I heard all about your disgrace, and I am writing to say that I am in disgrace too. I sneaked Wilcox's keys and got whisky for Sebastian and got caught. He did seem to want it so, and there was and is an awful row. Mr. Samgrass has gone, good, and I think he's a bit in disgrace too, but I don't know why. Mr. Mottram is very popular with Julia, bad, and is taking Sebastian away, bad, to a German doctor. Julia's tortoise disappeared. We think it buried itself as they do, so there goes a packet, expression of Mr. Mottram's. I am very well, with love from Cordelia." It must have been about a week after receiving this letter that I returned to my rooms in Paris one afternoon to find Rex waiting for me. "Well," I said, "well." "I came this morning. They told me where you usually lunch, but I couldn't see you there. Have you got him?" I didn't need to ask whom. "So he's given you the slip, too." "I had a run of luck at the Travellers and cleaned up a packet. Sebastian pinched the lot while I was asleep. All he left me was 2 first-class tickets to Zurich stuck in the edge of the looking-glass. I had nearly 300 quid, blast him. And now he may be almost anywhere. Anywhere. You're not hiding him by any chance?" No, my dealings with that family are over. I think mine are just beginning, said Rex. I say I've got a lot to talk about, and I promised the chap at the Travellers I'd give him his revenge this afternoon. Won't you dine with me? Yes, where? I usually go to Ciro's. Why not Paillard's? Never heard of it. I'm paying, you know. I know you are. Let me order dinner. Well, all right. What's the place again? I wrote it down for him. Is it the sort of place you see native life? Yes, you might call it that. Well, it'll be an experience. Order something good. That's my intention. If I had to spend an evening with him, it should at any rate be in my own way. I remember the dinner well. Soup of oseille, a sole quite simply cooked in a white wine sauce, a caneton à la presse, a lemon soufflé. And for wine I let him give me a bottle of 1906 Montrachet, then at its prime, and with the duck a Clos de Bèze of 1904. At the last minute, fearing that the whole thing was too simple for Rex, I added caviar aux blinis. The cream and hot butter mingled and overflowed, separating each glaucous bead of caviar from its fellows, capping it in white and gold. I like a bit of chopped onion with mine, said Rex. Chap who knew told me it brought out the flavour. Try it without first, I said, and tell me more news. Well, of course, Greenacre, or whatever he was called, the snooty Don, he came a cropper. That was well received by all. He was the blue-eyed boy for a day or two after you left. Shouldn't wonder if he hadn't put the old girl out to pitching you out. He was always being pushed down our throats, so in the end Julia couldn't bear it any more and gave him away. Julia did? Well, he'd begun to stick his nose into our affairs, you see. Julia spotted he was a fake, and one afternoon, when Sebastian was tight, he was tight most of the time, she got the whole story of the grand tour out of him, and that was the end of Mr. Samgrass. After that, the Marchioness began to think she might have been a bit rough with you. Well, what about the row with Cordelia? Oh, that eclipsed everything. That kid's a walking marvel. She'd been feeding Sebastian whiskey right under our noses for a week. We couldn't think where he was getting it. That's when the Marchioness finally crumbled. The soup was delicious after the rich blinis, hot, thin, bitter, frothy. I'll tell you a thing, Charles, that Ma Marchmain hasn't let on to anyone. She's a very sick woman. Might peg out any minute. The sole was so simple and unobtrusive that Rex failed to notice it. We ate to the music of the press, the crunch of the bones, the drip of blood and marrow, the tap of the spoon basting the thin slices of breast. Presently he began again on the Marchmains. I'll tell you another thing, too. They'll get a jolt financially soon if they don't look out. I thought they were enormously rich. Do you know how much they're overdrawn? Of course I don't. Jolly near 100,000 in London. I don't know what they owe elsewhere. Well, that's quite a package, you know, for people who aren't using their money. 98,000 last November. It's the kind of thing I hear. Those were the kind of things he heard. Mortal illness and debt, I thought. I rejoiced in the Burgundy. It seemed a reminder that the world was an older and better place than Rex knew, that mankind in its long passion had learned another wisdom than his. I don't mean that they'll be paupers. The old boy'll always be good for an odd 30,000 a year. But there'll be a shake-up coming soon, and when the upper classes get the wind up, their first idea is usually to cut down on the girls. I'd like to get the little matter of a marriage settlement through before it comes. We had by no means reached the cognac, but here we were on the subject of himself. He wanted a woman. He wanted the best on the market, and he wanted her at his own price. That's what it amounted to. Ma Marchmain doesn't like me. Well, I'm not asking her to. It's not her I want to marry. She hasn't the guts to say openly you're not a gentleman, you're an adventurer from the colonies. She says we live in different atmospheres. That's all right, but Julia happens to fancy my atmosphere. Then she brings up religion. I've nothing against her church. We don't take much account of Catholics in Canada, but that's different. In Europe you've got some very posh Catholics. Then there's my past. We know so little about you. She knows a sight too much. You may know I've been tied up with someone else for a year or two. I knew. Everyone who had ever met Rex knew of his affair with Brenda Champion. After the duck came a salad of watercress and chicory in a faint mist of chives. I tried to think only of the salad. I succeeded for a time in thinking only of the souffle. Then came the cognac and the proper hour for these confidences. Julia's just rising 20. I don't want to wait till she's of age. Anyway, I don't want to marry without doing the thing properly. Nothing hole in corner. I have to see she isn't jockeyed out of her proper settlement. So as the Marchioness won't play ball, I'm off to see the old man and square him. He lit a cigar and sat back at peace with the world. I, too, was at peace in another world than his. We both were happy. He talked of Julia, and I heard his voice, unintelligible at a great distance, like a dog's barking miles away on a still night. At the beginning of May, the engagement was announced. I saw the notice in the Continental Daily Mail, and assumed that Rex had squared the old man, but things did not go as were expected. The next news I had of them was in the middle of June, when I read that they had been married very quietly at the Savoy Chapel. It is time to speak of Julia, who till now has played an intermittent and somewhat enigmatic part in Sebastian's drama. It was thus she appeared to me at the time, and I to her. On my side, the interest was keener, for there was always the physical likeness between brother and sister, which, caught repeatedly in different poses under different lights, each time pierced me anew. And as Sebastian in his sharp decline seemed daily to fade and crumble, so much the more did Julia stand out clear and firm. When I first met her, when she met me in the station yard and drove me home through the twilight that high summer of 1923, she was just 18 and fresh from her first London season. Some said it was the most brilliant season since the war, that things were getting into their stride again. Julia was at the centre of it. There were then remaining perhaps half a dozen London houses which could be called historic. Marchmain House in St. James's was one of them, and the ball given for Julia, in spite of the ignoble costume of the time, was by all accounts a splendid spectacle. Sebastian went down for it, and half-heartedly suggested my coming with him. I refused, and came to regret my refusal, for it was the last ball of its kind given there, the last of a splendid series. How could I have known? There seemed time for everything in those days. The world was open to be explored at leisure. I was so full of Oxford that summer. London could wait, I thought. Nothing could have been further from Julia's ambitions than a royal marriage. She knew, or thought she knew, what she wanted, and it was not that. But wherever she turned, it seemed her religion stood as a barrier between her and her natural goal. As it seemed to her, the thing was a dead loss. If she apostatized now, having been brought up in the church, she would go to hell, while the Protestant girls of her acquaintance, schooled in happy ignorance, could marry eldest sons, live at peace with their world, and get to heaven before her. She had made a preposterous little picture of the kind of man who would do. He was an English diplomat of great but not very virile beauty, 32 or 3, and recently and tragically widowed. Julia thought she would prefer a man a little subdued by earlier grief. Someone like that would do, Julia thought, and she was in search of him when she met me at the railway station. I was not her man. Julia left Sebastian and me at Brideshead and went to stay with an aunt, Lady Roscommon, in her villa at Cap Ferrat. All the way she pondered her problem, for by that time she had met Rex Mottram. Rex's age was greatly in his favour, for among Julia's friends there was a kind of gerontophilic snobbery. Young men were held to be gauche and pimply. Rex, indeed, was neither starched nor wrinkled. His seniors thought him a pushful young cad, but Julia recognized the unmistakable chic, the flavour of Max and F.E. and the Prince of Wales, of the big table in the sporting club, the second magnum and the fourth cigar, of the chauffeur kept waiting hour after hour without compunction, which her friends would envy. His social position was unique. It had an air of mystery, even of crime about it. People said Rex went about armed. Rex and Brenda Champion were staying at the next villa on Cap Ferrat, taken that year by a newspaper magnate and frequented by politicians. They would not normally have come within Lady Roscommon's ambit, but living so close, the parties mingled, and at once Rex began warily to pay his court. Julia went to Salzburg to join her mother. Aunt Fanny tells me you've made great friends with Mr. Mottram. I'm sure he can't be very nice." "I don't think he is," said Julia. "I don't know that I like nice people." Rex, in the comparative freedom of London, became abject to Julia. He planned his life about hers, going where he would meet her, ingratiating himself with those who could report well of him to her. He sat on a number of charitable committees in order to be near Lady Marchmain. He offered his services to Brideshead in getting him a seat in Parliament, but was there rebuffed. He expressed a keen interest in the Catholic Church until he found that this was no way to Julia's heart. And then, without in the least expecting it, she suddenly found herself in love. It came to her, this disturbing and unsought revelation, one evening in May, when Rex had told her he would be busy at the house, and, driving by chance down Charles Street, she saw him leaving what she knew to be Brenda Champion's house. She was so hurt and angry that she could barely keep up appearances through dinner. As soon as she could, she went home and cried bitterly for 10 minutes. Then she felt hungry, wished she had eaten more at dinner, ordered some bread and milk, and went to bed, saying, "When Mr. Mottram telephones in the morning, whatever time it is, say I am not to be disturbed." Next afternoon she went shopping with her mother. They had tea with an aunt, and returned at 6. "Mr. Mottram is waiting, my lady. I've shown him into the library." "Oh, Mummy, must I see him? There'll be a scene if I do." "Nonsense, Julia. You twist that poor man round your finger." So Julia went into the library and came out an hour later, engaged to be married. "Oh, Mummy, I warned you this would happen if I went in there." Thus began a year's secret engagement for Julia, a time of great stress, for Rex made love to her that afternoon for the first time, not as it happened to her once or twice before with sentimental and uncertain boys, but with a passion that disclosed the corner of something like it in her. Their passion frightened her, and she came back from the confessional one day, determined to put an end to it. "Otherwise I must stop seeing you," she said. Rex was humble at once, just as he had been in the winter, day after day, when he used to wait for her in the cold in his big car. "If only we could be married immediately," she said. She took her problem to Farm Street and propounded it in general terms, not in the confessional, but in a dark little parlour kept for such interviews. "Surely, Father, it can't be wrong to commit a small sin myself in order to keep him from a much worse one." But the gentle old Jesuit was unyielding. She barely listened to him. He was refusing her what she wanted. That was all she needed to know. When he had finished, he said, "Now you had better make your confession." "No, thank you," she said, as though refusing the offer of something in a shop. "I don't think I want to today," and walked angrily home. From that moment she shut her mind against her religion. Then, after Julia had refused to make her Christmas communion, and Lady Marchmain had found herself betrayed, first by me, then by Mr. Samgrass, then by Cordelia, in the first grey days of 1925, she decided to act. She forbade all talk of an engagement. She forbade Julia and Rex ever to meet. Lady Marchmain disliked him. Lord Marchmain was on the whole relieved that Julia should have chosen so well, and gave his consent to an immediate marriage. There was trouble about the marriage settlement, with which Julia refused to interest herself. The lawyers were in despair. Rex absolutely refused to settle any capital. Rex hoped to have the whole of Julia's dowry in his hands to make it work for him. The lawyers insisted on tying it up, but they could not get, as they asked, a like sum from him. Finally, grudgingly, he agreed to insure his life. Last and least came the question of Rex's religion. He had once attended a royal wedding in Madrid, and he wanted something of the kind for himself. "There's one thing your church can do," he said, "put on a good show. You never saw anything to equal the cardinals. How many do you have in England?" "Only one, darling." "Only one? Can we hire some others from abroad?" It was then explained to him that a mixed marriage was a very unostentatious affair. "How do you mean mixed? I'm not a nigger or anything?" "No, darling, between a Catholic and a Protestant." "Oh, that. Well, if that's all, it's soon unmixed. I'll become a Catholic. What does one have to do?" So Rex was sent to Farm Street to Father Mowbray, a priest renowned for his triumphs with obdurate catechumens. After the third interview, he came to tea with Lady Marchmain. "The first day I wanted to find out what sort of religious life he had till now. so I asked him what he meant by prayer. He said, "I don't mean anything, you tell me." I tried to in a few words, and he said, "Right, so much for prayer, what's the next thing?" I gave him the catechism to take away. Yesterday I asked him whether our Lord had more than one nature. He said, "Just as many as you say, Father." Then again I asked him, supposing the Pope looked up and saw a cloud and said it's going to rain, would that be bound to happen? "Oh, yes, Father. But supposing it didn't?" He thought for a moment and said, "I suppose it would be sort of raining spiritually, and we were too sinful to see it." Lady Marchmain, he doesn't correspond to any degree of paganism known to the missionaries. "Julia," said Lady Marchmain when the priest had gone, "are you sure that Rex isn't doing this thing purely with the idea of pleasing us?" Next week the Jesuit came to tea again. It was the Easter holidays, and Cordelia was there too. "Lady Marchmain," he said, "you should have chosen one of the younger fathers for this task. I shall be dead long before Rex is a Catholic." "Oh, dear, I thought it was going so well." He seemed to be doing very well. He learned large bits of the catechism by heart, and the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary. Then I asked him, as usual, if there was anything troubling him, and he looked at me in a crafty way and said, "Look, Father, I don't think you are being straight with me. I want to join your church, and I'm going to join your church, but you are holding too much back." I asked what he meant, and he said, "I've had a long talk with a Catholic, a very pious, well-educated one, and I've learned a thing or two. For instance, that you have to sleep with your feet pointing east, because that's the direction of heaven, and if you die in the night you can walk there. Now I'll sleep with my feet pointing any way that suits Julia, but you expect a grown man to believe about walking to heaven? And what about the Pope, who made one of his horses a cardinal? And what about the box you keep in the church porch? And if you put in a pound note with someone's name on it, they get sent to hell. I don't say there mayn't be a good reason for all this," he said, "but you ought to tell me about it and not let me find out for myself." "What can the poor man have meant?" said Lady Marchmain. "You see, he's a long way from the church yet," said Father Mowbray. "But who can he have been talking to? Did he dream it all? Cordelia, what's the matter?" "What a chump! Oh, Mummy, what a glorious chump!" "Cordelia, it was you." "Oh, Mummy, who could have dreamed he'd swallow it? I told him such a lot besides about sacred monkeys and the Vatican, all kinds of things." "Well, you very considerably increased my work," said Father Mowbray. "Poor Rex," said Lady Marchmain. "You know, I think it makes him rather lovable. You must treat him like an idiot child, Father Mowbray." So the instruction was continued, and Father Mowbray at length consented to receive Rex a week before his wedding. "You'd think they'd be all over themselves to have me in," Rex complained. "I can be a lot of help to them one way and another. Instead, they're like the chaps who issue cards for a casino. What's more," he added, "Cordelia's got me so muddled I don't know what's in the catechism and what she's invented." Thus things stood 3 weeks before the wedding. The cards had gone out, presents were coming in fast, the bridesmaids were delighted with their dresses. Then came what Julia called Bridie's bombshell. "You'd better pack all that stuff up again." "Bridie, what do you mean?" "Only that the wedding's off." "Bridie." "I thought I'd better make some inquiries about my prospective brother-in-laws. No one else seemed interested," said Brideshead. "I got the final answer tonight. He was married in Montreal in 1915 to a Miss Sarah Evangeline Cutler, who is still living there." "Rex, is this true?" Rex stood with a jade dragon in his hand, looking at it critically. Then he set it carefully on its ebony stand and smiled openly and innocently at them all. "Sure it's true," he said. "What about it? What are you all looking so het up about? She isn't a thing to me. She never meant any good. I was only a kid anyway. The sort of mistake anyone might make. I got my divorce back in 1919. I didn't even know where she was living till Bridie here told me. What's all the rumpus?" "Don't you realize, you poor sweet oaf," said Julia, "that you can't get married as a Catholic when you've another wife alive?" "But I haven't. Didn't I just tell you we were divorced 6 years ago?" "But you can't be divorced as a Catholic." "I wasn't a Catholic, and I was divorced. I've got the papers. Anyhow, what about your Italian cousin Francesca? She married twice?" "She had an annulment." "All right, then, I'll get an annulment. What does it cost? Who do I get it from? Has Father Mowbray got one? I only want to do what's right. Nobody told me. It was a long time before Rex could be convinced of the existence of a serious impediment to his marriage. "Just a moment," said Rex, "just a moment. Maybe you can stop us marrying in your cathedral. All right, to hell. We'll be married in a Protestant church." "I can stop that too," said Lady Marchmain. "But I don't think you will, Mummy," said Julia. "You see, I've been Rex's mistress for some time now, and I shall go on being, married or not." "Rex, is this true?" "No, damn it, it's not," said Rex. "I wish it were." "I see we shall have to discuss it all again in the morning," said Lady Marchmain faintly. "I can't go on any more now." And she needed her son's help up the stairs. "What on earth made you tell your mother that?" I asked, when years later Julia described the scene to me. "That's exactly what Rex wanted to know. I suppose because I thought it was true. Not literally. There were all kinds of suggestions. That Rex should go to Canada, that Father Mowbray should go to Rome and see if there were any possible grounds for an annulment, that I should go abroad for a year. In the middle of it, Rex just telegraphed to Papa, "Julia and I prefer wedding ceremony take place by Protestant rites. Have you any objection?" He answered, "Delighted," and that settled the matter as far as Mummy stopping us legally went. Oh, Charles, what a squalid wedding! The Savoy Chapel was the place where divorced couples got married in those days. Poky little place, not at all what Rex had intended. Poor Cordelia took it hardest. She'd looked forward so much to being my bridesmaid. It was a thing we used to talk about long before I came out, and of course she was a very pious child, too. But I was still nuts about Rex. Funny to think of, isn't it? You know, Father Mowbray hit on the truth about Rex at once, that it took me a year of marriage to see. He simply wasn't all there. A tiny bit of a man, pretending he was the whole. Well, it's all over now. It was 10 years later that she said this to me in a storm in the Atlantic. I returned to London in the spring of 1926 for the general strike. "Oh, dear," said my father, meeting me by chance on the stairs, "how delightful to see you again so soon." I'd been abroad for 15 months. "You've come at a very awkward time, you know. They're having another of those strikes in 2 days. Such a lot of nonsense, and I don't know when you'll be able to get away." So I joined Bill Meadows' show, which was a flying squad protecting food deliveries in the poorest parts of London. It was through my membership of Bill Meadows' squad that Julia learned I was in England. She telephoned to say her mother was anxious to see me. "You will find her terribly ill," she said. I was shown into the library, and in less than a minute Julia joined me. She shook hands with a gentleness and gravity that were unfamiliar. In the gloom of that room she seemed a ghost. "It's sweet of you to come. Mummy has kept asking for you, but I don't know if she'll be able to see you now, after all. She's dying. She may live a week or two, or she may go at any minute. She's so weak. I know Mummy wanted to say how sorry she is she was so beastly to you last time you met. She's spoken about it often. She knows now that she was wrong about you. I'm quite sure you understood and put it out of your mind immediately, but it's the kind of thing Mummy can never forgive herself. It's the kind of thing she so seldom did. Do tell her I understand completely. The other thing, of course, you've guessed. Sebastian. She wants him. I don't know if that's possible. Is it? I hear he's in a very bad way. We heard that too. We cabled to the last address we had, but there was no answer. There still may be time for him to see her. I thought of you as the only hope as soon as I heard you were in England. Will you try and get him? It's an awful lot to ask, but I think Sebastian would want it too if he realized. Air France ran a service of a kind to Casablanca. There I took the bus to Fez, starting at dawn and arriving in the new town later the same day. I telephoned from the hotel to the British consul and dined with him that evening in his charming house by the walls of the old town. He was a kind, serious man. "I'm delighted someone has come to look after young Flight at last," he said. "He's been something of a thorn in our sides here. This is no place for a remittance man. The French don't understand him at all. They think everyone who's not engaged in trade is a spy. And now he's sick. The brothers took him away to the infirmary." Sebastian was in the wing kept for Europeans, where the beds were divided by low partitions into cubicles with some air of privacy. He was lying with his hands on the quilt, staring at the wall, where the only ornament was a religious oleograph. "Your friend," said the brother. He looked round slowly. "What are you doing here, Charles?" He was more than ever emaciated. Drink, which made others fat and red, seemed to wither Sebastian. The brother left us, and I sat by his bed and talked about his illness. "I was out of my mind for a day or two," he said. "I kept thinking I was back in Oxford." Then I told him about his mother. He said nothing for some time, but lay gazing at the oleograph of the $7. Then, poor Mummy, she really was a femme fatale, wasn't she? She killed at a touch. I telegraphed to Julia that Sebastian was unable to travel, and stayed a week at Fez, visiting the hospital daily until he was well enough to move. His first sign of returning strength on the second day of my visit was to ask for brandy. By next day he had got some somehow, and kept it under the bedclothes. I saw Sebastian home from the hospital. He seemed weaker in his basket chair than he had been in bed. I was able to straighten his money affairs before I left. He had lived till then by getting into difficulties and then telegraphing for odd sums to his lawyers. I saw the branch manager of the bank, and arranged for him, if funds were forthcoming from London, to receive Sebastian's quarterly allowance and pay him a weekly sum of pocket money, with a reserve to be drawn in emergencies. I had meant to return direct to Paris, but this business meant I must go to London and see Brideshead. And the doctor says Sebastian is killing himself with drink, weakening himself. He hasn't DTs or cirrhosis. He's not insane? Certainly not. Then he must have his allowance, as you suggest. The thing is quite clear. In some ways, Brideshead was an easy man to deal with. He had a kind of mad certainty about everything, which made his decisions swift and easy. "Would you like to do some paintings of this London house?" he asked suddenly. "A picture of the front, another of the back on the park, another of the staircase, another of the big drawing-room. 4 small oils. That's what my father wants done for a record to keep at Brideshead. I don't know any painters. Julia said you specialized in architecture." "Yes," I said, "I should like to, very much. You know it's going to be pulled down. My father's selling it. They're going to put up a block of flats here. They're keeping the name. We can't stop them, apparently." "What a sad thing." "Well, I'm sorry, of course. But you think it good architecturally?" "One of the most beautiful houses I know." "I can't see it. I've always thought it was rather ugly. Perhaps your pictures will make me see it differently." This was my first commission. I had to work against time, for the contractors were only waiting for the final signature to start their work of destruction. In spite, or perhaps because of that, for it is my vice to spend too long on a canvas, never content to leave well alone, those 4 paintings are particular favourites of mine, and it was their success, both with myself and others, that confirmed me in what has since been my career. I began in the long drawing-room, for they were anxious to shift the furniture. Bit by bit, minute by minute, the thing came into being. There were no difficulties. The intricate multiplicity of light and colour became a whole. The right colour was where I wanted it on the palette. Each brush stroke, as soon as it was complete, seemed to have been there always. Presently, on the last afternoon, I heard a voice behind me say, "May I stay here and watch?" I turned and found Cordelia. She was now 15, and had grown tall, nearly to her full height, in the last 18 months. She had not the promise of Julia's full Quattrocento loveliness. There was a touch of Brideshead already in her length of nose and high cheekbone. She was in black, mourning for her mother. "I'm tired," I said. "I bet you are. Is it finished?" "Practically. I must go over it again tomorrow." "Do you know, it's long past dinner time. There's no one here to cook anything now. I only came up today and didn't realize how far the decay had gone. You wouldn't like to take me out to dinner, would you?" We left by the garden door into the park and walked in the twilight to the Ritz Grill. "You've seen Sebastian? He won't come home even now?" I did not realize till then that she had understood so much. I said so. "Well, I love him more than anyone," she said. "It's sad. They've closed the chapel at Brideshead, Bridie and the bishop. Mummy's requiem was the last mass said there. After she was buried, the priest came in. I was there alone. I don't think he saw me, and took out the altar stone and put it in his bag. Then he burned the wads of wool with the holy oil on them and threw the ash outside. He emptied the holy water stoup and blew out the lamp in the sanctuary, and left the tabernacle open and empty, as though from now on it was always to be Good Friday. I suppose none of this makes any sense to you, Charles, poor agnostic. I stayed there till he was gone, and then suddenly there wasn't any chapel there any more, just an oddly decorated room. I can't tell you what it felt like. You've never been to Tenebris, I suppose? Never. Well, if you had, you'd know what the Jews felt about their temple. Quo modo sedet sola civitas. It's a beautiful chant. You ought to go once, just to hear it. Still trying to convert me, Cordelia? Oh, no, that's all over, too. Do you know what Papa said when he became a Catholic? Mummy told me once. He said to her, "You have brought back my family to the faith of their ancestors." Pompous, you know. It takes people different ways. Anyhow, the family haven't been very constant, have they? There's him gone, and Sebastian gone, and Julia gone. But God won't let them go for long, you know. I wonder if you remember the story Mummy read us the evening Sebastian first got drunk. I mean the bad evening. Father Brown said something like, "I caught him, the thief, with an unseen hook and an invisible line which is long enough to let him wander to the ends of the world and still to bring him back with a twitch upon the thread." We scarcely mentioned her mother. All the time we talked, she ate voraciously. Once she said, "I got on best with her of any of us, but I don't believe I ever really loved her, not as she wanted or deserved. It's odd I didn't, because I'm full of natural affections." "I never really knew your mother," I said. "You didn't like her. I sometimes think when people wanted to hate God, they hated Mummy." "What do you mean by that, Cordelia?" "Well, you see, she was saintly, but she wasn't a saint. No one could really hate a saint, could they? They can't really hate God either. When they want to hate him and his saints, they have to find something like themselves and pretend it's God and hate that. I suppose you think that's all bosh." I heard almost the same thing once before from someone very different. "Oh, I'm quite serious. I hope I've got a vocation." I don't know what that means. It means you can be a nun. If you haven't a vocation, it's no good however much you want to be. And if you have a vocation, you can't get away from it however much you hate it. Bridie thinks he has a vocation and hasn't. I used to think Sebastian had and hated it. But I don't know now. Everything has changed so much suddenly. "You'll fall in love," I said. "Oh, pray not." I say, do you think I could have another of those scrumptious meringues? My theme is memory, that winged host that soared about me one grey morning of wartime. For nearly 10 dead years after that evening with Cordelia, I was borne along a road outwardly full of change and incident, but never during that time, except sometimes in my painting, and that at longer and longer intervals, did I come alive as I had been during the time of my friendship with Sebastian. I took it to be youth, not life, that I was losing. My work upheld me, for I had chosen to do what I could do well, did better daily, and liked doing. Incidentally, it was something which no one else at that time was attempting to do. I became an architectural painter. But as the years passed, I began to mourn the loss of something I had known in the drawing-room of Marchmain House and once or twice since, the intensity and singleness, and the belief that it was not all done by hand, in a word, the inspiration. In quest of this fading light, I went abroad in the Augustan manner, laden with the apparatus of my trade, for 2 years' refreshment among alien styles. I did not go to Europe. By slow but not easy stages, I travelled through Mexico and Central America, in a world which had all I needed, and the change from Parkland and Hall should have quickened me and set me right with myself. But despite this isolation and this long sojourn in a strange world, I remained unchanged, still a small part of myself pretending to be whole. I discarded the experience of those 2 years with my tropical kit and returned to New York as I had set out. I had a fine haul, 11 paintings and 50-odd drawings. My wife, who crossed to New York to meet me and saw the fruits of our separation displayed in my agent's office, summed the thing up better by saying, "Of course, I can see they're perfectly brilliant and really rather beautiful in a sinister way, but somehow I don't feel they're quite you." In Europe, my wife was sometimes taken for an American, because of her dapper and jaunty way of dressing and the curiously hygienic quality of her prettiness. In America, she assumed an English softness and reticence. She arrived a day or 2 before me, and was on the pier when my ship docked. "It has been a long time," she said fondly when we met. And so a little time later, Celia and I embarked for the return journey to England. My wife's first thought on coming aboard was of the passenger list. "Such a lot of friends," she said. "It's going to be a lovely trip. Let's have a cocktail party this evening." The companionways were no sooner cast off than she was busy with the telephone. "Julia, this is Celia Ryder. It's lovely to find you on board. What have you been up to? Come and have a cocktail this evening and tell me all about it." "Julia who?" "Mottram. I haven't seen her for years." Nor had I. Not, in fact, since my wedding day. Not to speak to for any time since the private view of my exhibition, where the 4 canvases of Marchmain House lent by Brideshead had hung together, attracting much attention. Those pictures were my last contact with the Flights. Our lives, so close for a year or 2, had drawn apart. Sebastian, I knew, was still abroad. Rex and Julia, I sometimes heard said, were unhappy together. Rex was not prospering quite as well as had been predicted. He remained on the fringe of the government, prominent but vaguely suspect. I turned into some of the halls of the ship, which were huge without any splendour, as though they had been designed for a railway coach, and preposterously magnified. Here I am, I thought, back from the jungle, back from the ruins, here where wealth is no longer gorgeous, and power has no dignity. Quo modo sedet sola civitas. Charles. I looked behind me. Julia was sitting in a cube of blotting paper, her hands folded in her lap, so still that I had passed by without noticing her. "I heard you were here. Celia telephoned to me. It's delightful. I never see you now," she said. "I never seem to see anyone I like. I don't know why." But she spoke as though it were a matter of weeks rather than of years, as though, too, before our parting, we had been firm friends. She was not yet 30, but was approaching the zenith of her loveliness, all her rich promise abundantly fulfilled. Time had wrought change, too. Not for her the sly, complacent smile of La Gioconda. The years had been more than the sound of lyres and flutes, and had saddened her. Later, Julia said, "The purser says we're heading for dirty weather. What do you know about that?" Far less than the purser. The gale, which, unheard, unseen, unfelt, in our enclosed and insulated world, had for an hour been mounting over us, had now veered and fallen full on our bows. In my dressing-room, everything breakable had been stowed away. The door to the cabin was hooked open, and my wife called plaintively from within. "I feel terrible. I didn't know a ship of this size could pitch like this," she said. "Can't you do something? Can't you get something from the doctor?" I rang for the steward, who had a draught ready prepared, which comforted her a little. And all night, between dreaming and waking, I thought of Julia. I slept for an hour or 2, and when I awoke, the sea was as high as ever. Inky clouds swept over us, and the glass streamed still with water. But I had grown used to the storm in my sleep, had made its rhythm mine, had become part of it, so that I arose strongly and confidently, and found Julia already up and in the same temper. All day Julia and I spent together without interruption, talking, scarcely moving, held in our chairs by the swell of the sea, that day when I still stood on the extreme verge of love. 10 hours of talking. What had we to say? Plain fact mostly, the record of our 2 lives, so long widely separate, now being knit to one. She too had had her dead years. She told me of her long struggle with Rex as to whether she should have a child. At first she wanted one, but learned after a year that an operation was needed to make it possible. By that time Rex and she were out of love, but he still wanted his child, and when at last she consented, it was born dead. Rex has never been unkind to me intentionally, she said. He couldn't imagine why it hurt me to find, 2 months after we came back to London from our honeymoon, that he was still keeping up with Brenda Champion. I was glad when I found Celia was unfaithful, I said. I felt it was all right for me to dislike her. Is she? Do you? I'm glad. I don't like her either. Why did you marry her? Physical attraction, loneliness, missing Sebastian. You loved him, didn't you? Oh, yes. He was the forerunner. Julia understood. The ship creaked and shuddered, rose and fell. We thought Papa might come back to England after Mummy died, or that he might marry again, but he lives just as he did. Rex and I often go to see him now. I've grown fond of him. Sebastian's disappeared completely. Cordelia's in Spain with an ambulance. Bridie leads his own extraordinary life. He wanted to shut Brideshead after Mummy died, but Papa wouldn't have it for some reason, so Rex and I live there now, and Bridie has 2 rooms up in the dome next to Nanny Hawkins. Do you know, last year, when I thought I was going to have a child, I decided to have it brought up a Catholic. I hadn't thought about religion before. I hadn't since. But just at that time, when I was waiting for the birth, I thought, that's one thing I can give her. It doesn't seem to have done me much good, but my child shall have it. It was odd, wanting to give something one had lost oneself. Then in the end I couldn't even give that. I couldn't even give her life. I never saw her. I was too ill to know what was going on, and afterwards, for a long time until now, I didn't want to speak about her. She was a daughter, so Rex didn't so much mind her being dead. I've been punished a little for marrying Rex. You see, I can't get all that sort of thing out of my mind quite. Death, judgment, heaven, hell, Nanny Hawkins, and the catechism, it becomes part of oneself if they give it one early enough. And yet I wanted my child to have it. Now I suppose I shall be punished for what I've just done. Perhaps that is why you and I are here together like this, part of a plan. That was almost the last thing she said to me, part of a plan, before we went below before dinner. She went to her cabin to get ready, no one dressed that night, and I came with her uninvited, unopposed, expected, and behind closed doors took her in my arms and first kissed her. There was no alteration from the mood of the afternoon. But later that night, when she went to bed and I followed her to her door, she stopped me. No, Charles, not yet. Perhaps never. I don't know. I don't know if I want love. Then something, some surviving ghost from those dead 10 years, for one cannot die even for a little without some loss, made me say, love. I'm not asking for love. Oh, yes, Charles, you are, she said, and putting up her hand gently stroked my cheek, then shut her door. Next day the wind had again dropped, and again we were wallowing in the swell. Rain ceased at midday. At evening the clouds dispersed, and the sun, astern of us, suddenly broke into the lounge where we sat, putting all the lights to shame. Sunset, said Julia. The end of our day. She rose, and though the roll and pitch of the ship seemed unabated, led me up to the boat deck. She put her arm through mine, and her hand into mine in my greatcoat pocket. The deck was dry and empty, swept only by the wind of the ship's speed. In that minute, with her lips to my ear, and her breath warm in the salt wind, Julia said, though I had not spoken, "Yes, now." And as the ship righted herself, and for the moment ran into calmer waters, Julia led me below. It was no time for the sweets of luxury. They would come in their season with the swallow and the lime flowers. Now on the rough water there was a formality to be observed, no more. It was as though a deed of conveyance of her narrow loins had been drawn and sealed. I was making my first entry as the freeholder of a property I would enjoy and develop at leisure. "Oh dear," said Julia, "where can we hide in fair weather, we orphans of the storm?" I could not leave her that night, but early next morning, as once again I made my way back along the corridor, I found I could walk without difficulty. The ship rode easily on a smooth sea, and I knew our solitude was broken. My wife called joyously from her cabin, "Charles, Charles, I feel so well. What do you think I'm having for breakfast?" I went to see. She was eating a beefsteak. I did not speak to Julia alone all that day. We met for a minute next day on the starboard side of the ship, while everyone else crowded to port to see the officials come aboard and to gaze at the green coastline of Devon. "What are your plans?" "London for a bit," she said. "Celia's going straight home. She wants to see the children." "You too?" "No." "In London, then." On the morning of the private view, I telephoned to Julia and said, "I'm sick of the pictures already and never want to see them again, but I suppose I shall have to put in an appearance. Do you want me to come? I'd much rather you didn't." Celia sent a card with "Bring everyone" written across it in green ink. "When do we meet?" "In the train." When I reached the gallery, my wife was standing looking through the window to the street. From fashionable and unfashionable lips alike, I heard fragments of praise. "If you asked me to guess," I overheard, "Ryder's is the last name would have occurred to me. They're so virile, so passionate." At the end of the day, my wife said, "Darling, I must go. It's been a terrific success, hasn't it? I'll think of something to tell them at home, but I wish it hadn't got to happen quite this way." So she knows, I thought. She's a sharp one. She's had her nose down since luncheon and picked up the scent. I let her get clear of the place, and I remembered my train. As I stood on the platform by the restaurant car, I saw my luggage and Julia's go past, with Julia's sour-faced maid strutting beside the porter. They'd begun shutting the carriage doors when Julia arrived, unhurried, and took her place in front of me. I had a table for two. It was night as we drew out of Paddington, and the glow of the town gave place first to the scattered lights of the suburbs, then to the darkness of the fields. "It seems days since I saw you," I said. "6 hours, and we were together all yesterday. You look worn out." "It's been a day of nightmare. I think Celia knows about us." "Well, she had to know sometime." "What about Rex?" "Rex isn't anybody at all," said Julia. "He just doesn't exist." The knives and forks jingled on the tables as we sped through the darkness. Rex, in his early 40s, had grown heavy and ruddy. He had lost his Canadian accent and acquired instead the hoarse, loud tone that was common to all his friends. There were half a dozen of these friends in the Tapestry Hall, politicians, young conservatives in the early 40s, with sparse hair and high blood pressure. The storm of talk arose and whirled about our ears. "Of course he can marry her and make her queen tomorrow." "We had our chance in October. Why didn't we send the Italian fleet to the bottom of Mare Nostrum? Why didn't we blow Spezia to blazes? Why didn't we land on Pantelleria?" "Franco's simply a German agent. They tried to put him in to prepare air bases to bomb France. That bluff has been called, anyway. All we want is a showdown. A showdown with Baldwin, a showdown with Hitler, a showdown with the old gang. That I should live to see my country the land of Clive and Nelson." "I wonder which is the more horrible," I said. "Celia's art and fashion, or Rex's politics and money?" "Why worry about them?" "Oh, my darling Julia, why is it that love makes me hate the world? It's supposed to have quite the opposite effect. I feel as though all mankind, and God too, were in a conspiracy against us." They are. But we've got our happiness in spite of them. Here and now we've taken possession of it. They can't hurt us, can they?" Not tonight, not now. Not for how many nights? Do you remember the storm, said Julia? Do you remember how the sun came out on our last evening? So much to remember, she said. How many days have there been since then when we haven't seen each other? 100, do you think? Not so many. Oh, yes, quite 100 days. 100 days wasted out of 2 years and a bit. Not a day's coldness or mistrust or disappointment. Never that. We fell silent. When at length Julia spoke, she said sadly, How many more? Another 100? A lifetime. I want to marry you, Charles. One day. Why now? War, she said. This year, next year, sometime soon. I want a day or two with you of real peace. What do you mean by peace, if not this? So much more. And then in a chill, matter-of-fact tone, she continued, Marriage isn't a thing we can take when the impulse moves us. There must be a divorce, 2 divorces. We must make plans. Plans? Divorce? War? On an evening like this? Sometimes, said Julia, I feel the past and the future pressing so hard on either side that there's no room for the present at all. Shutters were up, curtains drawn, candles lit in the painted parlour. Hello, it's laid for 3. Lord Brideshead arrived half an hour ago, my lady. He sent a message, would you please not wait dinner for him, as he may be a little late. When we had been a quarter of an hour at the table, he joined us, coming ponderously into the room in the bottle-green velvet smoking suit which he kept at Brideshead and always wore when he was there. At 38 he had grown heavy and bald, and might have been taken for 45. Well, he said, well, only you two. I hope to find Rex here. He sat down opposite me and bowed his sparse pink head over his plate. Well, Bridie, what's the news? As a matter of fact, he said, I have some news. I am engaged to be married. I hope you're pleased. Bridie, how very exciting. Who to? Oh, no one you know. Is she pretty? I don't think you'd exactly call her pretty. Comely is the word I think of in her connection. She is a big woman. Fat? No, big. She is called Mrs. Musprat. Her Christian name is Beryl. I have known her for a long time, but until last year she had a husband. Now she is a widow. But, Bridie, where did you find her? Her late husband, Admiral Musprat, collected matchboxes, he said with complete gravity. Julia trembled on the verge of laughter, recovered her self-possession, and asked, You're not marrying her for her matchboxes? No, no. The whole collection was left to the Falmouth Town Library. Bridie, said Julia, you sly, smug old brute, why haven't you brought her here? Oh, I couldn't do that, you know. What can you mean? Brideshead raised his head and looked solemnly at his sister, and continued in the same simple way, as though he were saying nothing particularly different from what had gone before. I couldn't ask her here as things are. You must understand that Beryl is a woman of strict Catholic principle, fortified by the prejudices of the middle class. I couldn't possibly bring her here. It's a matter of indifference whether you choose to live in sin with Rex, or Charles, or both. I have always avoided inquiry into the details of your ménage, but in no case would Beryl consent to be your guest. Julia rose. Why, you pompous ass, she said, stopped, and turned towards the door. At first I thought she was overcome by laughter. Then, as I opened the door to her, I saw with consternation that she was in tears. I hesitated. She slipped past me without a glance. I found her in the darkest refuge of the garden, took her in my arms, and she pressed her face to my heart. Aren't you cold out here? She did not answer, only clung closer to me and shook with sobs. In the 2 years of our love, which seemed a lifetime, I had not seen her so moved, nor felt so powerless to help. How dare he speak to you like that, I said, the cold-blooded old humbug. But I was failing her in sympathy. No, she said, it's not that. He's quite right. They know all about it, Bridie and his widow. They've got it in black and white. They bought it for a penny at the church door. All in one word, too, one little flat, deadly word that covers a lifetime. Living in sin. Not just doing wrong, as I did when I went to America. Finding you, the past 2 years with you, all the future with you, all the future with or without you. War coming, world ending, sin. A word from so long ago, from Nanny Hawkins stitching by the hearth and the nightlight burning before the Sacred Heart. Cordelia and me with the catechism in Mummy's room before luncheon on Sundays. Mummy carrying my sin with her to church, bowed under it in the black lace veil in the chapel. Mummy dying with it, Christ dying with it, nailed hand and foot, hanging over the bed in the night nursery. No way back, the gates barred. All the saints and angels posted along the walls, thrown away, scrapped, rotting down. Nameless and dead, like the baby they wrapped up and took away before I had seen her. But, darling, I won't believe that great spout of tears came just from a few words of Bridie's. You must have been thinking about it before. Hardly at all, said Julia, now and then, more lately with the last trump so near. Of course it's a thing psychologists could explain, a preconditioning from childhood, feelings of guilt from the nonsense you were taught in the nursery. You do know at heart that it's all bosh, don't you? How I wish it was. Sebastian once said almost the same thing to me. He's gone back to the church, you know, said Julia. Of course he never left it as definitely as I did. I've gone too far. There's no turning back now, I know that. If that's what you mean by thinking it all bosh. All that I can hope to do is to put my life in some sort of order in a human way, before all human order comes to an end. That's why I want to marry you. I should like to have a child. That's one thing I can do. Next night, Rex and his political associates were with us. They won't fight. Goering told a friend of mine, Goebbels told a friend of mine, Ribbentrop told me that the army just kept Hitler in power so long as he was able to get things for nothing. The moment anyone stands up to him, he's finished. The army will shoot him. All that's wanted is a good strong line. We'll give Europe a good strong line. Europe is waiting for a speech from Rex. And a speech from me. And a speech from me. Rally the freedom-loving peoples of the world. Germany will rise. Austria will rise. The Czechs and the Slovaks are bound to rise. To a speech from Rex and a speech from me. What about a rubber? How about a whiskey? Which of you chaps will have a big cigar? Hello, you two going out? Yes, Rex, said Julia. Charles and I are going into the moonlight. We shut the windows behind us, and the voices ceased. The moonlight lay like hoarfrost on the terrace, and the music of the fountain crept in our ears. The stone balustrade of the terrace might have been the Trojan walls, and in the silent park might have stood the Grecian tents where Cressid lay that night. A few days, a few months, no time to be lost. A lifetime between the rising of the moon and its setting. Then the dark. Summer passed. Delirious crowds cheered Neville Chamberlain's return from Munich. Rex made a rabid speech in the House of Commons, which sealed his fate one way or the other. The divorces were much talked of among our friends. Even in that summer of general alarm, there were still corners where private affairs commanded first attention. It was necessary for Rex and Julia to separate formally, and since for the time being Brideshead was still her home, she remained there, and Rex removed his trunks and valet to their house in London. Evidence was taken against Julia and me in my flat. A date was fixed for Brideshead's wedding, early in the Christmas holidays. One afternoon in November, Julia and I stood at a window in the drawing-room, watching the wind at work stripping the lime trees. "We shan't see them in spring," said Julia, "perhaps never again." "Once before," I said, "I went away, thinking I should never return. Perhaps years later to what's left of it, with what's left of us." A door opened and shut in the darkling room behind us. Wilcox approached through the firelight into the dusk about the long windows. "A telephone message, my lady, from Lady Cordelia." "Lady Cordelia? Where was she?" "In London, my lady." "Wilcox, how lovely! Is she coming home?" "She was just starting for the station. She will be here after dinner." "I haven't seen her for 12 years, I said. "Not since the evening when we dined together, and she spoke of being a nun. The evening when I painted the drawing-room at Marchmain House. She was an enchanting child. She's had an odd life, first the convent, then, when that was no good, the war in Spain. I have not seen her since then." When Cordelia made her appearance, she was tired from her journey. I thought her an ugly woman. She looked more than her 26 years. Hard living had roughened her. Constant intercourse in a foreign tongue had worn away the nuances of speech. We went up, all three together, to the old nursery. Julia and I always spent part of our day there. Nanny Hawkins and my father were two people who seemed impervious to change, neither an hour older than when I first knew them. As we sat there talking, and I saw Cordelia's fond eyes on all of us, I began to realize that she too had a beauty of her own. "I saw Sebastian last month," she said. "What a time he's been gone. Was he quite well?" "Not very. That's why I went. It's quite near, you know, from Spain to Tunis. He's with the monks there." "It's frightening," Julia once said, "to think how completely you have forgotten Sebastian." "He was the forerunner. That's what you said in the storm. I've thought since perhaps I am only a forerunner too." I had not forgotten Sebastian. He was with me daily in Julia, or rather it was Julia I had known in him in those distant Arcadian days. I had not forgotten Sebastian. Every stone of the house had a memory of him, and hearing him spoken of by Cordelia as someone she had seen a month ago, my lost friend filled my thoughts. When we left the nursery, I said, "I want to hear all about Sebastian." "I heard he was dying," she said. "He was in the infirmary of the head house of some missionary fathers." I went straight there and saw the superior. He told me how Sebastian had turned up with his beard and his suitcase and asked to be admitted as a lay brother. The superior said, "My friend, you need a missionary for yourself." And he said, "Yes, of course," and then he sent him away. Next day he came back again. He had been drinking. The superior simply said, I did not think there was anything I could do to help him except pray. He was a very holy old man and recognized it in others. Holiness? Oh, yes, Charles. That's what you've got to understand about Sebastian. Well, finally one day they found Sebastian lying outside the main gate, unconscious. At first they thought he was merely drunk again. Then they realized he was very ill, so they put him in the infirmary, where he'd been ever since. I stayed a fortnight with him till he was over the worst of his illness. He looked terrible, any age, rather bald, with a straggling beard, but he had his old sweet manner. They'd given him a room to himself. It was barely more than a monk's cell, with a bed and a crucifix and white walls. I didn't suggest him coming home. I knew he wouldn't, and he was too weak still to argue it out. He seemed quite happy by the time I left. He'll never be able to go into the bush, of course, or join the order, but the Father Superior is going to take charge of him. They had the idea of making him a sort of under-porter. Poor Sebastian, I said. It's too pitiful. How will it end? I think I can tell you exactly, Charles. I've seen others like him, and I believe they are very near and dear to God. He'll live on, half in, half out of the community, a familiar figure pottering round with his broom and his bunch of keys. He'll be a great favourite with the old fathers, something of a joke to the novices. Everyone will know about his drinking. He'll develop little eccentricities of devotion, intense personal cults of his own. He'll be found in the chapel at odd times and missed when he's expected. Then, one morning, after one of his drinking bouts, he'll be picked up at the gate, dying, and show by a mere flicker of the eyelid that he is conscious when they give him the last sacraments. It's not such a bad way of getting through one's life. I thought of the youth with the teddy bear under the flowering chestnuts. It's not what one would have foretold, I said. I suppose he doesn't suffer. Oh, yes, I think he does. One can have no idea what the suffering may be, to be maimed as he is, no dignity, no power of will. No one is ever holy without suffering. It's taken that form with him. I've seen so much suffering in the last few years. There's so much coming for everybody soon. It's the spring of love. And then, in condescension to my paganism, she added, he's in a very beautiful place, you know, by the sea. White cloisters, a bell tower, rows of green vegetables, and a monk watering them when the sun is low. I laughed. You knew I wouldn't understand. You and Julia, she said. And then, as we moved on towards the house, when you met me last night, did you think, poor Cordelia, such an engaging child, grown up a plain and pious spinster, full of good works? Did you think thwarted? It was no time for prevarication. Yes, I said, I did. I don't now so much. It's funny, she said. That's exactly the word I thought of for you and Julia when we were up in the nursery with Nanny. Thwarted passion, I thought. That night I woke in the darkness and lay awake, turning over in my mind the conversation with Cordelia. How I had said, you knew I would not understand. How often it seemed to me I was brought up short, like a horse in full stride, suddenly refusing an obstacle, backing against the spurs, too shy even to put his nose at it and look at the thing. And another image came to me, of an Arctic hut, and a trapper alone with his furs, an oil lamp and log fire, everything dry and shipshape and warm inside, and outside the last blizzard of winter raging and the snow piling up against the door. Quite silently, a great weight forming against the timber, the bolt straining in its socket. Minute by minute, in the darkness outside, the white heap sealing the door, until quite soon, when the wind dropped and the sun came out on the ice slopes and the thaw set in, a block would move, slide and tumble high above, gather weight, till the whole hillside seemed to be falling, and the little lighted place would open and splinter and disappear, rolling with the avalanche into the ravine. My divorce case, or rather my wife's, was due to be heard at about the same time as Brideshead was to be married. Julia's would not come up till the following term. Meanwhile, the game of General Post was in full swing, and we were all in varying degrees homeless, when a halt was called, and Lord Marchmain, with a taste for the dramatically inopportune, which was plainly the prototype of his elder sons, declared his intention, in view of the international situation, of returning to England and passing his declining years in his old home. Julia and I, who had left Brideshead a month before, thinking we should not return, moved back for the reception. When the day came, Cordelia went to the station, and we remained to greet him at home. Julia gave a little sigh of surprise and touched my hand. We had seen him 9 months ago at Monte Carlo, where he had been an upright and stately figure, little changed from when I first met him in Venice. Now he was an old man. Yes, said Cara, he has come home to die. The weeks of illness wore on, and the life of the house kept pace with the faltering strength of the sick man. Brideshead was called. It was the Easter holidays, and Beryl was busy with her children. He came alone, and having stood silently for some minutes beside his father, who sat silently looking at him, he left the room, and joining the rest of us who were in the library, said, Papa must see a priest. Oh, Bridie, do you think he would? Asked Cordelia. I shall see that he does, said Brideshead. I shall take Father Mackay in to him tomorrow morning. Julia, alone with me, said, Charles, I see great church trouble ahead. I said, can't they even let him die in peace? They mean something so different by peace. It would be an outrage. No one could have made it clearer all his life what he thought of religion. They'll come now, and his mind's wandering, and he hasn't the strength to resist, and claim him as a deathbed penitent. Julia, I said, how can we stop this tomfoolery? She did not answer for some time. Then, "Why should we? What's it got to do with you or me, whether my father sees his parish priest?" I knew these moods of Julia's, and dimly surmised their origin. I knew they could not be assuaged by words, nor could I have spoken, for the answer to her question was still unformed. The sense that the fate of more souls than one was at issue, that the snow was beginning to shift on the high slopes. I had met Father Mackay several times. He was a stocky, middle-aged, genial Glasgow Irishman. This morning he made a hearty breakfast, glanced at the headlines of the paper, and then said with professional briskness, "And now, Lord Brideshead, would the poor soul be ready to see me, do you think?" Cara was reading the paper aloud to Lord Marchmain. Brideshead said, "I've brought Father Mackay to see you." Lord Marchmain said, "Father Mackay, I am afraid you have been brought here under a misapprehension. I am not in extremis, and I have not been a practising member of your church for 25 years. Brideshead, show Father Mackay the way out." I carried the news to Julia, who lay with her bed-table amidst a litter of newspapers and envelopes. "Mumbo-jumbo is off," I said. "The witch-doctor has gone." Poor Papa. It's great sucks to Bridie. I felt triumphant. I had been right. Everyone else had been wrong. Truth had prevailed. The threat that I had felt hanging over Julia and me ever since that evening at the fountain had been averted, perhaps dispelled forever. The weeks passed. Still Lord Marchmain lived on. In June my divorce was made absolute, and my former wife married for the second time. Julia would be free in September. The nearer our marriage got, the more wistfully I noticed Julia spoke of it. War was growing nearer too. We neither of us doubted that. Lord Marchmain took little interest in events outside his own room. Next to death, perhaps because they are like death, he feared darkness and loneliness. He liked to have us in his room and the lights burnt all night among the gilt figures. He did not wish us to speak much, but he talked himself, so quietly that we often could not hear him. He talked, I think, because his was the only voice he could trust when it assured him that he was still alive. What he said was not for us, nor for any ears but his own. Better today, better today. I can see now in the corner of the fireplace where the mandarin is holding his gold bell, and the crooked tree is in flower below his feet, where yesterday I was confused and took the little tower for another man. Soon I shall see the bridge and the 3 stalks, and know where the path leads over the hill. Better tomorrow. We live long in our family and marry late. 73 is no great age. Aunt Julia, my father's aunt, lived to be 88, born and died here, never married, saw the fire on Beacon Hill for the Battle of Trafalgar, always called it the New House. That was the name they had for it in the nursery, and in the fields when unlettered men had long memories. You can see where the old house stood near the village church. They called the field Castle Hill. Those were our roots in the waste hollows of Castle Hill, in the briar and nettle, among the tombs in the old church and the chantry where no clerk sings. We were knights then, barons since Agincourt. The larger honours came with the Georges. Better today. I have lived carefully, sheltered myself from the cold winds, eaten moderately of what was in season, drunk fine claret, slept in my own sheets. I shall live long. When the summer comes, said Lord Marchmain, oblivious of the deep corn and swelling fruit, and the surfeited bees who slowly sought their hives in the heavy afternoon sunlight outside his windows, when the summer comes, I shall leave my bed and sit in the open air and breathe more easily. Thus till mid-July Lord Marchmain lay dying, wearing himself down in the struggle to live. Then, since there was no reason to expect an immediate change, Cordelia went to London to see her women's organisation about the coming emergency. That day Lord Marchmain became suddenly worse. He lay silent and quite still, breathing laboriously. Only his open eyes, which sometimes moved about the room, gave any sign of consciousness. "Is this the end?" Julia asked. "It is impossible to say," the doctor answered. "When he does die, it will probably be like this. He may recover from the present attack. The only thing is not to disturb him. The least shock will be fatal." "I'm going for Father Mackay," she said. I was not surprised. I'd seen it in her mind all the summer. When she had gone, I said to the doctor, "We must stop this nonsense." He said, "My business is with the body. It's not my business to argue whether people are better alive or dead or what happens to them after death. I only try to keep them alive." "And you said just now any shock would kill him. What could be worse for a man who fears death as he does than to have a priest brought to him, a priest he turned out when he had the strength?" "I think it may kill him." In half an hour, Julia was back with Father Mackay. We all met in the library. "I've telegraphed for Bridie and Cordelia," I said. "I hope you agree that nothing must be done till they arrive." "I wish they were here," said Julia. "You can't take the responsibility alone," I said. "Everyone else is against you. Dr. Grant, tell her what you said to me just now." "I said that the shock of seeing a priest might well kill him. Without that he may survive this attack. As his medical man, I must protest against anything being done to disturb him." Julia, who had been standing still and silent, suddenly moved. "Thank you for your advice, Doctor," she said. "I take full responsibility for whatever happens. Father Mackay, will you please come and see my father now?" And without looking at me, led him to the door. The priest bent over Lord Marchmain and blessed him. Julia and Cara knelt at the foot of the bed. The doctor, the nurse, and I stood behind them. "Now," said the priest, "I know you are sorry for all the sins of your life, aren't you? Make a sign if you can. You're sorry, aren't you?" But there was no sign. "Try and remember your sins. Tell God you are sorry. I'm going to give you absolution. While I am giving it, tell God you are sorry you have offended him." He began to speak in Latin. I recognized the words "Ego te absolvo in nomine Patris," and saw the priest make the sign of the cross. Then I knelt too and prayed, "O God, if there is a God, forgive him his sins, if there is such a thing as sin." And the man on the bed opened his eyes and gave a sigh, the sort of sigh I had imagined people made at the moment of death, but his eyes moved so that we knew there was still life in him. I suddenly felt the longing for a sign, if only of courtesy, if only for the sake of the woman I loved, who knelt in front of me, praying I knew for a sign. It seemed so small a thing that was asked, the bare acknowledgment of a present, a nod in the crowd. I prayed more simply, "God forgive him his sins, and please God make him accept your forgiveness." So small a thing to ask. The priest took a little silver box from his pocket and spoke again in Latin, touching the dying man with an oily wad. He finished what he had to do, put away the box, and gave the final blessing. Suddenly, Lord Marchmain moved his hand to his forehead. I thought he'd felt the touch of the chrism and was wiping it away. "Oh, God," I prayed, "don't let him do that." But there was no need for fear. The hand moved slowly down his breast, then to his shoulder, and Lord Marchmain made the sign of the cross. Then I knew that the sign I had asked for was not a little thing, not a passing nod of recognition, and a phrase came back to me from my childhood of the veil of the temple being rent from top to bottom. It was over. We stood up. The nurse went back to the oxygen cylinder. The doctor bent over his patient. Julia whispered to me, "Will you see Father Mackay out? I am staying here for a little." Thus I come to the broken sentences, which were the last words spoken between Julia and me, the last memories. When her father died, Julia remained some minutes with his body. When at last we met alone, it was by stealth, like young lovers. Julia said, "Here in the shadow, in the corner of the stair, a minute to say goodbye." So long to say so little. You knew since this morning, since before this morning, all this year. I didn't know till today. Oh, my dear, if you could only understand, then I could bear to part, or bear it better. I should say my heart was breaking if I believed in broken hearts. I can't marry you, Charles. I can't be with you ever again. I know. How can you know? What will you do? Just go on, alone. How can I tell what I shall do? You know the whole of me. You know I'm not one for a life of mourning. I've always been bad. Probably I shall be bad again, punished again. But the worse I am, the more I need God. I can't shut myself out from his mercy. That is what it would mean, starting a life with you without him. One can only hope to see one step ahead. But I saw today there was one thing unforgivable, like things in the schoolroom so bad that they were unpunishable, that only Mummy could deal with, the bad thing I was on the point of doing, that I am not quite bad enough to do, to set up a rival good to God's. Why should I be allowed to understand that, and not you, Charles? It may be because of Mummy, Nanny, Cordelia, Sebastian, perhaps Bridie and Mrs. Musprat, keeping my name in their prayers. Or it may be a private bargain between me and God, that if I give up this one thing I want so much, however bad I am, he won't quite despair of me in the end. Now we shall both be alone, and I shall have no way of making you understand. I don't want to make it easier for you, I said. I hope your heart may break, but I do understand. The avalanche was down. The hillside swept bare behind it. The last echoes died on the white slopes. The new mound glittered and lay still in the silent valley. "The worst place we've struck yet," said the commanding officer. "No facilities, no amenities. Ryder, you will find a fatigue party of 50 and report to the quartering commandant at the house at 10:45 hours. He'll show you what we're taking over." "Very good, sir." "Wonderful old place in its way," said the quartering commandant. "Pity to knock it about too much. There's a caretaker and a couple of old servants live at the top. They won't be any trouble to you. And a blitzed R.C. padre, whom Lady Julia gave a home to. Jittery old bird, but no trouble. He's opened the chapel. That's in bounds for the troops. Surprising lot use it, too. The place belongs to Lady Julia Flight, as she calls herself now. She was married to Mottram, the minister of whatever it is. She's abroad in some woman's service, and I try to keep an eye on things for her. It did not take us long to make our tour of the echoing rooms. Then we went outside on the terrace. "Hooper," I said when I'd seen my men started, "do you think I can safely leave you in charge of the work party for half an hour?" "Righty-o. I say, did you say you knew this place before?" "Yes, very well. It belongs to friends of mine." And as I said the words, they sounded as odd in my ears as Sebastian's had done, when instead of saying, "It is my home," he said, "It is where my family live." It doesn't seem to make any sense, one family in a place this size. What's the use of it? Well, I suppose the brigade are finding it useful. But that's not what it was built for, is it? No, I said, that's not what it was built for. Perhaps that's one of the pleasures of building, like having a son, wondering how he'll grow up. I don't know. I never built anything, and I forfeited the right to watch my son grow up. I'm homeless, childless, middle-aged, loveless Hooper. There was one part of the house I had not yet visited, and I went there now. The chapel showed no ill effects of its long neglect. The Art Nouveau paint was as fresh and bright as ever. The Art Nouveau lamp burned once more before the altar. I said a prayer, an ancient, newly learned form of words, and left, turning towards the camp. And as I walked back and the cookhouse bugle sounded ahead of me, I thought, the builders did not know the uses to which their work would descend. They made a new house with the stones of the old castle. Year by year, generation after generation, they enriched and extended it. Year by year, the great harvest of timber in the park grew to ripeness, until, in sudden frost, came the age of Hooper. The place was desolate, and the work all brought to nothing. Quomodo sedet sola civitas. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And yet, I thought, stepping out more briskly towards the camp, where the bugles, after a pause, had taken up the second call and were sounding pick 'em up, hot potatoes, and yet that is not the last word, it is not even an apt word. It is a dead word from 10 years back. Something quite remote from anything the builders intended has come out of their work, and out of the fierce little human tragedy in which I played, something none of us thought about at the time. A small red flame, a beaten copper lamp of deplorable design relit before the beaten copper doors of a tabernacle. The flame which the old knights saw from their tombs, which they saw put out. That flame burns again for other soldiers far from home, farther in heart than Acre or Jerusalem. It could not have been lit but for the builders and the tragedians. And there I found it this morning, burning anew among the old stones. I quickened my pace and reached the hut which served us for our anteroom. "You're looking unusually cheerful today," said the second-in-command.